There is a place on Highway 101 where all sound stops at once. The stretch of road runs parallel to Lake Crescent's northern shore, winding through old-growth forest that hasn't been logged since the 1930s. The pavement is smooth. The shoulder is wide. There are no sharp turns, no blind corners, no reasons for concern. During the day, tourists drive it without incident, stopping at pullouts to photograph the water through Douglas fir and western hemlock. But after dark, in a specific window of time, the road becomes something else. The anomaly was first documented in April of 2003 by a Washington State Patrol officer named David Brennan. He had been driving his usual overnight route when, at exactly 2:47 a.m., his dashboard radio cut to static. Then his police scanner went silent. Then his cell phone showed no signal. He pulled over near milepost 232 and stepped out of the vehicle. The forest was utterly quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic hum. He described it later as the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without meaning to. Brennan stood on the shoulder for what he estimated was 15 minutes. When he checked his watch, it was 3:13 a.m. His radio had returned. His phone showed full signal. He filed a report the next morning with his supervisor, noting the time, the location, and the duration. The report was logged and forgotten until it happened again. Lake Crescent sits in a glacial trough nearly 600 feet deep, carved during the last ice age and filled with water so clear that objects on the lake bed remain visible at depths of 60 feet. The lake is cold year-round, with surface temperatures rarely exceeding 50 degrees. It is surrounded by Olympic National Park on three sides, with Highway 101 running along its northern edge. The area is remote. The nearest town, Port Angeles, is 18 miles east. Cell service has always been unreliable in the region, a consequence of terrain and limited infrastructure. But the silence grid is different. It does not follow the usual patterns of dead zones or geographical interference. It occurs in the same 3-mile stretch, always between 2:47 and 3:12 a.m., and it affects every electronic device simultaneously. Car radios, GPS systems, smartphones, satellite communicators, even older analog equipment that should function independently of cellular networks. The blackout is total, localized, and precise. Over the next 5 years, 18 separate incidents were reported to the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. Most were drivers who pulled over in confusion, waited out the silence, and continued on their way. A few were more unsettling. In September of 2006, a long-haul trucker named Ramon Delgado was driving westbound on Highway 101 when his CB radio went dead. He had been talking to another driver several miles ahead. Mid-sentence, the line cut to static. Delgado tried his phone. No signal. He glanced at his GPS unit. The screen was frozen, showing his last known position near milepost 231. He slowed the truck but kept driving. The headlights illuminated the road ahead. The white lines, the reflective markers, everything normal. But the silence inside the cab was absolute. He could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear the faint creak of the seat beneath him. But the engine, which had been rumbling steadily for the past 6 hours, made no sound. Delgado later told investigators that he looked at the tachometer. The needle showed the engine was running. The truck was moving. But there was no auditory confirmation. He rolled down the window. Outside, the forest was silent. No wind through the trees. No gravel crunching under the tires. Nothing. At 3:12 a.m., sound returned all at once. The engine roared. The CB radio crackled with voices. His GPS updated its position. Delgado pulled into a rest stop 7 miles west and sat in the cab for 20 minutes before continuing his route. He filed a report with the Washington State Department of Transportation the following week. The report was acknowledged but not investigated. A pattern researcher named Dr. Elliot Marsh reviewed the incident logs in 2009 as part of a broader study on electromagnetic anomalies in the Pacific Northwest. Marsh had spent 15 years documenting unexplained signal disruptions in remote areas, from radio blackouts in the Cascade Range to compass deviations near Mount Rainier. The silence grid interested him because of its consistency. Most dead zones are irregular, Marsh explained in a recorded interview. They shift with weather, with solar activity, with changes in infrastructure, but this one doesn't. It occurs at the same time, in the same place, every single night. That's not interference. That's transmission. Marsh requested access to Federal Communications Commission records for the region. He wanted to know if any broadcast towers, relay stations, or government installations were operating near milepost 232. The FCC provided topographical maps and a list of licensed transmitters within a 50-mile radius. None were located along the silence grid. Marsh then contacted the U.S. Forest Service to ask if any experimental equipment had been installed in Olympic National Park. The Forest Service confirmed that no communication infrastructure existed in that section of forest, and none had ever been proposed. Marsh drove the route himself in November of 2009. He equipped his vehicle with a spectrum analyzer, a radio frequency detector, and a portable seismograph. He entered the silence grid at 2:49 a.m. All three devices shut down simultaneously. Marsh sat in the dark, surrounded by instruments that no longer functioned, and waited. At 3:11 a.m., the devices reactivated. The spectrum analyzer showed a spike in radio frequency activity during the blackout window, but the data was corrupted. Marsh attempted to replicate the drive 4 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time, the equipment failed in the same way. He submitted his findings to the Journal of Environmental Electromagnetics in early 2010. The paper was rejected. The editor noted that the results could not be independently verified and suggested Marsh conduct further fieldwork. Marsh never returned to the site. Local rumors about the silence grid began circulating in online forums around 2011. Drivers who had experienced the phenomenon posted their accounts on regional message boards and paranormal websites. Some described feeling watched during the blackout. Others reported seeing lights in the forest, brief flashes, low to the ground, moving parallel to the road. A few mentioned time discrepancies, claiming that their watches showed different times than their car clocks when the silence ended. A retired Forest Service ranger named Margaret Osborne was interviewed by a Seattle-based journalist in 2012. Osborne had worked in Olympic National Park for 32 years and had driven Highway 10 hundreds of times during night patrols. She confirmed that rangers were aware of the silence grid and had been for decades. "We don't talk about it with tourists," Osborne said, "but we know. Everyone who works out here knows. You just don't drive that stretch between 2:30 and 3:30 if you can help it. And if you do, you keep moving. You don't stop. You don't get out of the car." When asked why, Osborne hesitated. Because some of the people who stopped didn't feel right afterward. They couldn't explain it. Just said they felt like something had looked at them. Really looked, not with eyes. The journalist pressed for specifics. Osborne declined to provide names, but mentioned that at least 3 rangers had requested reassignment after experiencing the silence grid firsthand. She also noted that Park Service radio logs from the 1980s and 90s contained references to the quiet zone and advised personnel to avoid the area during early morning hours. The journalist submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for those radio logs. The National Park Service acknowledged the request, but stated that records from that period had been damaged in a warehouse flood in 2004. No copies were available. In 2015, a team of graduate students from the University of Washington attempted to document the silence grid using motion-activated cameras and audio recorders placed along the roadside. They positioned 6 devices at half-mile intervals within the affected zone and left them running for 2 weeks. When they returned to collect the equipment, 4 of the cameras were missing. The remaining 2 had recorded nothing but static during the 2:47 to 3:12 a.m. window. The audio recorders had captured 25 minutes of silence each night, followed by a brief burst of sound that resembled human speech played backward. Analysis of the audio proved inconclusive. The students submitted their findings as part of a senior thesis on environmental anomalies. The thesis was accepted, but never published. One of the students, whose name was not included in publicly available records, later told a colleague that she would never return to Lake Crescent. She did not elaborate. The Washington State Department of Transportation installed new cellular relay equipment along Highway 101 in 2017. The upgrades were intended to improve signal coverage for emergency services. Engineers reported that the equipment functioned normally during testing, but experienced intermittent failures near milepost 232. Maintenance crews noted that certain components would reset themselves without input, always during the early morning hours. The issue was classified as a low-priority technical glitch and left unresolved. Jibsa. The silence grid continues. Drivers still report blackouts, phones still lose signal, and between 2:47 and 3:12 a.m., the forest along Lake Crescent remains perfectly, impossibly quiet. No official investigation has been opened, no scientific explanation has been offered. The road remains open. The anomaly persists. And those who have experienced it, who have sat in that silence and felt the weight of something unseen pressing against the edges of their awareness, rarely speak of it afterward. They simply choose a different route. In 1978, a surveyor discovered 47 river stones arranged in perfect intervals along the Hoh River, each carved with sequential numbers in a language that predates known native scripts. When researchers returned to document them 6 weeks later, the stones had been replaced. Same positions, different numbers, continuing the sequence. Someone has been counting in the rainforest for a very long time. The Hoh River Valley cuts through the wettest region of the continental United States, a temperate rainforest where annual rainfall exceeds 140 inches. Sitka spruce and western hemlock rise 200 feet above a forest floor blanketed in moss and ferns. The river itself originates from the Blue Glacier on Mount Olympus, carrying glacial silt that turns the water a pale gray-green. The valley has been occupied by the Hoh tribe for thousands of years, and their oral histories describe the river as a boundary between the known world and something older. The trail along the river's southern bank was established by the National Park Service in 1938. It runs 18 miles from the ranger station to the base of the glacier, passing through forest so dense that sunlight rarely reaches the ground. Few hikers complete the full distance. The terrain is difficult. The humidity is oppressive, and there are places along the trail where compasses spin without reason. In May of 1978, a land surveyor named Thomas Kowalski was hired by the Park Service to update topographical maps of the valley. Kowalski had worked in Olympic National Park for 12 years and knew the region well. On the morning of May 9th, he was conducting measurements near mile marker 7 when he noticed something unusual on the riverbank. A series of stones had been placed in a straight line along the water's edge. Each stone was roughly the size of a human fist, smooth and dark gray, likely river rock. They were spaced exactly 6 feet apart. Kowalski counted 47 stones extending downstream for nearly 300 feet. What made them remarkable was the carving on each one. Every stone bore a single symbol. The symbols were not pictographs or petroglyphs in the traditional sense. They resembled numerical notation, but the characters did not match any writing system Kowalski recognized. The carvings were precise, uniform, in depth, and showed no signs of weathering. He photographed 12 of the stones with a Polaroid camera and noted their coordinates in his field journal. When Kowalski returned to the ranger station that evening, he showed the photographs to the head ranger, a man named Vincent Aldrich. Aldrich had served in the park for 23 years and had never seen anything like it. The carvings did not resemble Ho or Quileute tribal markings. They did not match any known historical script. Aldrich contacted the University of Washington's Department of Anthropology the following day. Dr. Margaret Holloway, an anthropologist specializing in indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest, arrived at the Ho River Valley on June 14th. She was accompanied by 2 graduate students and a photographer. Kowalski led them to the site. The stones were still there, arranged in the same line, but something had changed. The symbols had been altered. Holloway examined each stone carefully. The carvings were still present, still uniform, still weathered in a way that suggested great age. But the symbols themselves were different. They appeared to follow a sequential pattern, as if continuing from where the previous set had ended. Holloway documented 39 of the stones before losing daylight. She planned to return the next morning to complete the survey. When the team arrived at 6 a.m. on June 15th, they found the stones missing. Not scattered, not buried, simply gone. The depressions where the stones had rested were still visible in the riverbank, each shallow indentation precisely 6 feet from the next. Holloway and her team searched the area for 3 hours. They found no trace of the stones, no drag marks, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. 2 days later, on June 17th, a park ranger named Sandra Okoye was conducting a routine patrol along the same section of trail. She found the stones again, same location, same arrangement, same spacing. But the symbols had changed once more. Okoye photographed 7 of the stones with her personal camera before radioing Aldrich. By the time Holloway's team returned that afternoon, the stones were gone. Over the next 6 months, the stones appeared and disappeared 11 times. Each appearance lasted between 18 and 72 hours. The symbols changed with each iteration, always following what appeared to be a numerical sequence. Holloway documented every occurrence, photographing as many stones as possible before they vanished. She sent rubbings of the symbols to linguists, archaeologists, and cryptographers across the country. None could identify the language. A professor of ancient languages at Stanford University named Richard Pemberton examined the rubbings in September of 1978. He noted similarities to Proto-Sumerian numerical systems, but emphasized that the characters did not match any known written language. "It's as if someone is using a base system we don't understand," Pemberton wrote in his analysis. "The sequence is logical, but the logic is not ours." In October, Holloway arranged for carbon dating of the riverbed soil where the stones had rested. The samples were sent to a laboratory at the University of Arizona. The results indicated that the depressions in the soil were approximately 400 years old. The stones themselves, when briefly examined during one of their appearances, showed tool marks, consistent with pre-industrial carving techniques. But the precision of the symbols suggested modern machining. A member of the Ho tribe, an elder named Joseph Whitehorse, was interviewed by Holloway in November. Whitehorse was reluctant to speak about the stones, but eventually shared a story passed down through his family. He described a place in the valley where the river remembers what came before. He said his grandfather had warned him never to touch stones that had been marked by the ones who count. When asked who the ones who count were, Whitehorse said he did not know. He only knew they had been there longer than the Ho people. The National Park Service quietly discouraged further investigation. In December of 1978, Aldrich received a memo from the regional office stating that the stones were likely a hoax and that continued research would be a waste of resources. Holloway was informed that her access to the site would be restricted pending a formal review of her findings. The review never occurred. In January of 1979, Holloway submitted her research to the Journal of American Archaeology. The paper included photographs, soil analysis, linguistic evaluations, and witness testimony. It was rejected without review. The editor's response noted that the evidence was insufficient to support extraordinary claims and suggested that Holloway had been the victim of an elaborate prank. Holloway returned to the Hoh River Valley in March of 1979 with a team of volunteers. They set up motion-activated cameras along the riverbank and monitored the site for 2 weeks. The cameras captured nothing. The stones did not reappear. Holloway conducted 3 more expeditions over the following year. Each time, the site remained empty. In 1981, a logger working near the Hoh River reported finding a single carved stone in the bed of a tributary stream. The stone bore a symbol that matched one of Holloway's photographs. The logger turned the stone over to the Park Service. It was logged into evidence and sent to a storage facility in Seattle. When Holloway requested access to the stone in 1982, she was told it had been lost during a facility relocation. Kowalski, the surveyor who first discovered the stones, left his position with the Park Service in 1983. In a letter to Holloway, he wrote, "I've been back to that section of the river a dozen times. I've never seen the stones again, but I've felt them. You know what I mean. You stand on that bank and you know something is counting." No official explanation has ever been provided for the counting stones. The photographs still exist, stored in the archives of the University of Washington. The symbols remain untranslated, and the riverbank, that 300-foot stretch near mile marker 7, continues to show faint depressions in the soil, each one exactly 6 feet from the next. Hikers occasionally report finding smooth stones along the Hoh River. Some are carved, most are not, and those who have seen the carvings describe them differently every time, as if the numbers continue to change, marking time in a sequence only they understand. The voice on the radio should not have been there. Destruction Island sits 3 miles off the coast of Washington State, a flat expanse of rock and grass barely 30 acres in size. The island received its name in 1775 after a Spanish expedition lost 7 sailors to a sudden storm near its shores. For most of its history, the island remained uninhabited except for seabirds and harbor seals. In 1891, the U.S. Lighthouse Board constructed a lighthouse and keeper's quarters on the island's highest point. The light operated continuously until 1968, when it was automated and the last keeper departed. By 1983, the island housed only a small Coast Guard monitoring station, staffed by rotating teams of 2 or 3 personnel. The station's primary function was to monitor maritime radio traffic and weather conditions along the Olympic Peninsula coast. The waters surrounding Destruction Island are treacherous. Fog can descend without warning. Currents shift unpredictably. Ships have foundered there for centuries, their remains scattered across the seabed in water too deep for casual salvage. The station itself was a modest concrete building adjacent to the lighthouse, equipped with radio receivers, weather instruments, and basic living quarters. Supplies arrived by helicopter every 2 weeks. The assignment was considered tedious but safe. Personnel spent their days logging routine transmissions from fishing vessels and cargo ships. Nights were quiet. The island had no permanent power grid, relying instead on diesel generators that ran only during daylight hours. After dark, the station operated on battery reserves, and the only sounds were wind, waves, and the occasional crackle of distant radio chatter. On the night of October 7, 1983, Petty Officer Second Class James Halloway was monitoring the emergency frequency when he heard a woman's voice. Halloway had been stationed on Destruction Island for 6 weeks. He was 24 years old, from Portland, Oregon, and accustomed to long hours of silence. The emergency frequency, 121.5 megahertz, was reserved for maritime distress calls. It was rarely used outside of genuine emergencies, and even then, transmissions were brief and urgent. Halloway had never heard anything like the broadcast that began at 11:43 p.m. The voice was calm, measured, almost clinical. A woman speaking in English with no discernible accent. She was reading coordinates, latitude and longitude, spoken in degrees, minutes, and seconds, with pauses between each set of numbers. Halloway grabbed a pencil and began transcribing. The first set of coordinates placed a location approximately 60 miles west of Destruction Island in open ocean. The second set was farther out, nearly 80 miles offshore. The third was southeast, closer to the coast. The woman continued, reading coordinates for 19 minutes. Halloway counted 17 distinct locations. He plotted them on a nautical chart spread across his desk. The coordinates formed no obvious pattern. Some were in deep water, others were near underwater ridges or seamounts. None corresponded to known shipping lanes, fishing grounds, or navigational hazards. When the transmission ended at 12:02 a.m., there was no sign-off. The voice simply stopped and the frequency returned to static. Halloway immediately radioed the Coast Guard station in Port Angeles. He reported the transmission, provided the coordinates, and requested guidance. The duty officer in Port Angeles, a chief petty officer named Laura Ventura, told him to log the incident and monitor for follow-up transmissions. She noted that no distress calls had been reported that evening, and no vessels were known to be in trouble. Ventura said she would forward the information to the district office in the morning. The next night, at 11:43 p.m., the broadcast resumed. It was the same voice, the same calm cadence, the same precise enunciation of coordinates. Halloway recorded the transmission on a cassette tape using the station's backup equipment. This time, the broadcast lasted 18 minutes and included 16 coordinates. When it ended, Halloway rewound the tape and listened again. The woman's voice was clear and steady, with no background noise, no static, no environmental interference. It sounded as if she were broadcasting from a studio. Halloway contacted Ventura again. She listened to a portion of the recording over the radio and instructed him to continue monitoring. By the third night, a second Coast Guard technician, Petty Officer First Class Robert Nguyen, had been sent to Destruction Island to assist. Nguyen brought additional recording equipment and a direction-finding receiver designed to locate the source of radio transmissions. The broadcast occurred again at 11:43 p.m. on October 9th. Nguyen attempted to triangulate the signal using the direction-finding equipment. The receiver indicated that the transmission was coming from the southwest, somewhere over open water. But the signal strength was inconsistent. It would spike briefly, then fade, then return at full strength. Nguyen described it as impossible to lock down. He noted in his report that the transmission behaved more like a reflection than a direct signal, as if it were bouncing off the ionosphere or being distorted by atmospheric conditions. Over the next 8 nights, the broadcast repeated, always at 11:43 p.m., always lasting between 16 and 19 minutes, always the same voice, reading coordinates in the same methodical tone. Halloway and Nguyen recorded every transmission. They plotted every coordinate on charts and cross-referenced them with maritime records, geological surveys, and historical shipping logs. Nothing matched. The coordinates pointed to empty ocean. On the 10th night, October 16th, The woman's voice added something new. After reading the final set of coordinates, she paused for several seconds. Then she said, "Departing now." The transmission ended. Holloway and Nguyen waited for further communication. None came. The 11th night, October 17th, the broadcast stopped mid-sentence. The woman had read 12 coordinates when her voice simply cut off, replaced by static. The transmission did not resume. Holloway and Nguyen monitored the frequency for the remainder of the night. Silence. The broadcasts never returned. The Coast Guard launched a formal investigation on October 18th. A team of communication specialists from the 13th District Headquarters in Seattle traveled to Destruction Island to examine the station's equipment and review the recordings. They confirmed that the transmissions had been received on the emergency frequency and that the tapes were authentic. The voice was human, not synthesized. The coordinates were real, even if their significance remained unclear. Investigators checked missing persons reports along the West Coast. They searched for women who had disappeared at sea or gone missing from coastal communities in the weeks leading up to October 7th. No matches were found. The voice on the recordings was compared against samples from known maritime radio operators, Coast Guard personnel, and civilian broadcasters. No match was identified. A linguist at the University of Washington analyzed the recordings for speech patterns, regional accents, and vocal stress markers. The linguist's report noted that the speaker exhibited no signs of distress, fatigue, or urgency. Her breathing was steady. Her pitch was consistent. The pauses between coordinates were uniform, suggesting she was reading from a prepared text. "This is not someone in danger," the report concluded. "This is someone delivering information." The Federal Communications Commission was contacted to determine if any licensed transmitters in the region could account for the broadcasts. The FCC confirmed that no stations were authorized to operate on the emergency frequency, and no illegal transmitters had been detected in the area during October of 1983. The investigation expanded to include the Navy, which operated several facilities along the Washington coast. The Navy stated that none of its installations had transmitted on 121.5 megahertz during the relevant time frame. In December of 1983, the investigation was quietly closed. The official report classified the broadcasts as unexplained radio phenomena and noted that no distress situation had been confirmed. The recordings were archived at Coast Guard headquarters in Seattle. Holloway and Nguyen were reassigned to other stations. Neither spoke publicly about the incident. Johor. In 1997, a marine archaeologist named Dr. Patricia O'Malley was conducting research on historical shipwrecks off the Olympic Peninsula. While reviewing old maritime records, she discovered a reference to the Destruction Island broadcasts in a footnoted Coast Guard report. Intrigued, O'Malley requested access to the archived recordings through a Freedom of Information Act filing. Her request was denied. The Coast Guard stated that the materials were part of an ongoing investigation, despite the case having been closed 14 years earlier. O'Malley contacted Holloway, who had since retired from the Coast Guard and was living in Eugene, Oregon. In a phone interview, Holloway confirmed the details of the broadcasts and provided O'Malley with copies of the coordinates he had transcribed in 1983. O'Malley plotted the coordinates using modern GPS software and overlaid them with current oceanographic data. She found that several of the coordinates corresponded to underwater geological features that had not been mapped in 1983. One coordinate marked the location of a seamount discovered in 1992. Another pointed to a deep-sea trench that was not documented until 2001. O'Malley attempted to publish her findings in a maritime history journal. The article was rejected. Editors questioned the authenticity of the story and noted the lack of corroborating evidence. O'Malley reached out to Nguyen, hoping he could provide additional testimony. Nguyen declined to be interviewed. In a brief email, he wrote, I'd rather not revisit that. Some things don't need explaining. Pum. The recordings remain in a storage facility in Seattle. The coordinates remain unexplained. And every October for 19 minutes, beginning at 11:43 p.m., the emergency frequency on Destruction Island is silent. Halloway, now in his 60s, still remembers the woman's voice. He says it sounded like someone who knew exactly where she was going. The signature never changes, no matter how many times they burn the book. Graves Creek marks the eastern boundary of Olympic National Park's backcountry, a region of old-growth forest where trails narrow to game paths and human presence becomes sparse. The creek itself flows from the Graves Creek Basin, a glacial valley surrounded by peaks that remain snow-capped 9 months of the year. The area was named in 1889 after a prospector named Alfred Graves disappeared while searching for gold in the upper basin. His camp was found intact, his supplies untouched, but Graves himself was never seen again. The Ranger cabin was built in 1934 by the Civilian Conservation Corps as part of a network of backcountry shelters. It sits 3 miles from the trailhead, just beyond the point where cell phone service fades completely. The structure is simple: a single room with wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and 2 narrow windows facing the creek. For decades, it served as an overnight station for rangers on patrol. By the 1980s, budget cuts and changing park management policies left the cabin largely abandoned. It remained standing as an emergency shelter, marked on maps but rarely visited. The cabin contains a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a wooden shelf holding emergency supplies. On the desk sits a visitor's log, a standard spiral-bound notebook where hikers are encouraged to record their names, dates, and comments. Most backcountry shelters in Olympic National Park maintain similar logs. They provide a record of who passed through, when, and in what condition. The logs are collected annually by park staff and archived as part of the park's historical documentation. The log at Graves Creek is different. In June of 2007, a seasonal ranger named Michael Dunlap was conducting a routine inspection of backcountry facilities when he stopped at the Graves Creek cabin. Dunlap had been working in Olympic National Park for 3 summers and was familiar with the area. He entered the cabin, checked the fireplace for animal nests, and verified that the emergency supplies were intact. Then he opened the visitor's log. The entries were unusual. Every single one was written in the same handwriting. The penmanship was precise, almost mechanical, with uniform letter spacing and consistent slant. Each entry followed an identical format: a date, the words "arrived safely," and a signature that read "departing soon." No elaboration, no commentary, no names. The dates spanned decades. The first entry was marked May 3, 1952. The most recent was dated June 1, 2007, just 11 days before Dunlap's arrival. There were hundreds of entries, filling nearly 70 pages. Dunlap flipped through the log, noting that the handwriting never varied. The ink appeared fresh throughout, showing no signs of fading despite the purported age of some entries. Dunlap photographed several pages and brought the log back to park headquarters in Port Angeles. He showed it to the district ranger, a woman named Carla Rubenstein, who had overseen the Olympic backcountry for 14 years. Rubenstein examined the log and agreed that it was strange. She suggested it was likely a prank, someone with access to the cabin systematically filling in false entries to create the appearance of continuity. Rubenstein filed a report and instructed Dunlap to replace the log with a new notebook. The old log was placed in storage. 3 weeks later, Dunlap returned to Graves Creek. The new log he had installed contained 6 entries. All were written in the same handwriting as before. All were signed "Departing Soon." Rubenstein traveled to the cabin herself in August of 2007. She brought a fingerprint kit and a handwriting analyst from the Washington State Patrol. The analyst, a forensic examiner named Dr. Ellen Ramirez, compared the entries in the new log with photographs of the original. Ramirez confirmed that the handwriting was consistent across all samples. She noted that the script exhibited characteristics of practiced penmanship, possibly learned through formal training in the mid-20th century. "This is not someone imitating a style," Ramirez said in her written report. "This is someone writing naturally in their own hand." The fingerprints on the pages were inconclusive. Most were smudged or partial, rendered useless by humidity and handling. The few clear prints belonged to park personnel who had touched the logs during inspections. Rubenstein installed a motion-activated trail camera inside the cabin, mounted above the desk and aimed at the visitor's log. She returned 2 weeks later to retrieve the memory card. The camera had captured nothing. The memory card contained only footage of the empty cabin interior, hours of unchanging stillness. Yet the visitor's log contained 3 new entries, each dated within the time frame covered by the camera. The handwriting was the same. The signature was the same. Rubenstein removed the log entirely and locked it in her office. She replaced it with a plain notebook from a local stationery store, unmarked and spiral-bound. She told no one about the substitution except for her immediate supervisor. Within 10 days, the new notebook contained entries dating back to 1952, written in the same hand, signed, "Departing Soon." A park volunteer named Gregory Walsh visited the cabin in September of 2007. Walsh was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Olympia who had been hiking Olympic National Park trails since the 1960s. He later told investigators that when he opened the visitor's log, he recognized the handwriting. "It was the same style I used to see in old school records," Walsh said, "the kind of cursive they taught before the war, very formal, very deliberate. Nobody writes like that anymore." Walsh read through several pages of entries. He noticed that the dates were chronological, with no gaps or repetitions. Each entry appeared exactly 1 week after the previous one, suggesting a pattern of regular visits. Walsh left the cabin without signing the log. He reported the anomaly to Rubenstein the following day. The National Park Service opened an internal investigation in October of 2007. A team of regional officials reviewed the case, examined the physical evidence, and interviewed Dunlap, Rubenstein, and Walsh. The investigators theorized that someone with knowledge of the cabin's access schedule was making clandestine visits to maintain the entries. They installed a second trail camera outside the cabin, covering the approach trail. They also placed a coded lock on the door and restricted access to a small list of personnel. The cameras outside captured routine wildlife activity: deer, elk, occasional black bears, but no human visitors. The lock on the door remained undisturbed, yet the entries continued. By December, the log contained 42 new entries, all dated sequentially, all signed "Departing Soon." In January of 2008, Rubenstein removed the log again and replaced it with a blank journal. This time, she sealed the old log in an evidence bag and sent it to a forensic laboratory in Seattle for chemical analysis. The lab tested the ink, the paper, and the binding. The ink was standard blue ballpoint, consistent with brands commonly available since the 1950s. The paper showed no unusual properties, but the ink itself presented a problem. Chemical degradation analysis indicated that all the entries, including those purportedly written in 1952, had been made within the past 5 years. The ink had not aged appropriately for decades-old writing. Either the entries were recent forgeries backdated to appear historical, or something was preventing the normal aging process. The laboratory could not explain the discrepancy. A senior chemist named Dr. Aaron Villanueva, who conducted the analysis, noted in his report. The results are contradictory. The handwriting analysis suggests continuity over decades. The ink analysis suggests recent origin. I cannot reconcile these findings. Rubenstein contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation in March of 2008. An agent specializing in document fraud reviewed the case files, but declined to open a formal investigation. The agent's reasoning was straightforward. No crime had been committed. No one was missing. No property had been damaged. The entries, while unexplained, posed no threat to public safety. The agent recommended that the Park Service simply remove the log and discontinue its use. Rubenstein followed that advice. In April of 2008, she permanently removed the visitor's log from Graves Creek cabin and replaced it with a sign stating that the log was no longer maintained. The cabin remained accessible to hikers as an emergency shelter, but official record-keeping ceased. 2 months later, a hiker named Jennifer Santos reported finding a handwritten note on the desk inside the cabin. The note read, "Arrived safely, departing soon." It was written on a torn piece of notebook paper in the same handwriting that had filled the logs. Santos left the note where she found it and reported the incident to park headquarters. When rangers returned to investigate, the note was gone. The Graves Creek cabin remains standing. The desk is still there, bare except for dust and the occasional leaf blown in through the door. Hikers use the shelter infrequently, mostly during storms or late-season snow. Most leave no trace of their presence, but some who have stayed overnight report finding marks on the desk surface, faint impressions as if someone had been writing with enough pressure to leave indentations in the wood. The marks form letters, always the same letters, always the same signature. The Park Service no longer discusses the visitor's log. Rubenstein retired in 2012. Dunlap transferred to a different park in 2010. The original logs remain in storage at park headquarters, filed under Miscellaneous Historical Documents. And in the cabin, in the silence of the backcountry, the desk waits. Empty, but not forgotten, as if someone will return at any moment to sign their name one more time before departing. The lake has a place where the bottom falls away into something that should not exist. Lake Quinault sits in a glacial valley on the southwestern edge of Olympic National Forest, surrounded by temperate rainforest that receives over 12 feet of rain annually. The lake stretches roughly 4 miles long and 1 mile wide, fed by the Quinault River and dozens of smaller tributaries flowing from the surrounding mountains. The water is dark, stained brown by tannins from centuries of decomposing cedar and hemlock. Visibility rarely exceeds 10 feet, even on clear days. The Quinault Indian Nation has inhabited the area for thousands of years. Their oral histories describe the lake as a place of power, where the boundary between the surface world and what lies beneath grows thin. Elders speak of a section along the eastern shore where canoes would drift despite paddling, where fishing nets would disappear into depths that pulled with unexpected force. The stories were passed down as warnings. Avoid the eastern shore after dark, and never anchor where the water turns still. Modern surveys of Lake Quinault began in 1923, when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers conducted the first comprehensive depth measurements as part of a regional water resource assessment. The lake's maximum depth was recorded at 245 feet, located roughly in the center of the basin. Subsequent surveys in 1957 and 1976 confirmed these findings. The lake's bathymetry was considered well documented, its features unremarkable compared to other glacial lakes in the Pacific Northwest. But fishermen knew differently. In August of 1991, a commercial fishing guide named Marcus Thibodeau was leading a group of tourists on Lake Quinault when his depth finder malfunctioned. Thibodeau had been guiding on the lake for 11 years and knew its contours intimately. He was navigating near the eastern shore, approximately half a mile south of the Quinault Rainforest Ranger Station, when the device began displaying erratic readings. The depth finder showed 120 feet, then 200, then 500. Thibodeau assumed the unit was faulty and switched to his backup device. The second unit displayed similar readings. As he drifted farther into the zone, the numbers climbed: 800 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet. The deepest reading Thibodeau recorded was 2,137 feet before he gunned the engine and moved back toward the center of the lake. When he returned to shallower water, both depth finders resumed normal operation. Thibodeau reported the incident to the ranger station that evening. A park technician tested his equipment the following day and found both units functioning correctly. The technician suggested that Thibodeau had encountered a sonar reflection anomaly, possibly caused by underwater terrain or dense vegetation. Thibodeau accepted the explanation but remained uneasy. He had fished Lake Quinault for over a decade and had never experienced anything similar. Over the next 2 months, 3 other guides reported identical malfunctions in the same area. Each described their depth finders displaying impossible readings along a roughly quarter-mile stretch of the eastern shore. The zone seemed consistent. It began near a submerged rock formation locals called the Sentinel and extended south toward a small inlet known as Echo Cove. All 4 guides began avoiding the area, sharing warnings through informal channels. Within a year, most commercial operators on Lake Quinault knew to steer clear of the eastern shore's southern section. In 1992, the U.S. Geological Survey was conducting a comprehensive study of glacial lakes in Washington state as part of a broader climate research initiative. Lake Quinault was included in the survey due to its size and ecological significance. A team led by hydrologist Dr. Sarah Patel arrived in June with sonar equipment designed to produce high-resolution bathymetric maps. The survey proceeded normally for the first 3 days. The team mapped the northern and western sections of the lake, confirming depths consistent with historical records. On the 4th day, they moved to the eastern shore. Dr. Patel later described what happened in a recorded interview conducted years after the project concluded. "We were running standard multi-beam sonar," Patel said. "The system was calibrated, the weather was clear, and the water was calm. When we crossed into the zone the fishermen had mentioned, the sonar returns went haywire. We weren't getting a lake bottom, we were getting void. Just signal disappearing into depth that shouldn't have been there." The team spent 6 hours attempting to collect reliable data. They recalibrated the equipment 3 times. They adjusted frequencies, changed transducers, and cross-referenced with GPS to ensure their position was accurate. Nothing worked. The sonar consistently showed depths exceeding 2,000 feet in an area where geological surveys indicated the bedrock was less than 300 feet below the surface. Patel contacted the USGS regional office in Seattle that evening. She was instructed to document the anomaly thoroughly and continue the survey. Over the next 2 days, the team mapped the anomalous zone from multiple angles, collecting hundreds of data points. The results were consistent: a roughly circular area approximately 1,000 feet in diameter where standard sonar could not detect a lake bottom. The team completed their work and returned to Seattle in early July. Patel submitted her findings along with the raw sonar data. She was told the information would be reviewed and incorporated into the final survey report. The report was published in 1993. It made no mention of the anomaly. The bathymetric map included with the report showed the eastern shore of Lake Quinault at a uniform depth of 180 feet. A retired Navy sonar technician named Douglas Kim read about Lake Quinault's depth anomaly in a regional fishing magazine in 1998. The article, written by a journalist who had interviewed several guides, treated the story as local folklore. Kim was intrigued. He had spent 20 years working with underwater acoustic systems and recognized that the described behavior was inconsistent with standard sonar malfunction. Kim contacted Thibodeau and arranged to visit Lake Quinault in September of 1998. He brought his own equipment, a portable side-scan sonar unit and a handheld depth finder used by recreational boaters. Thibodeau guided him to the eastern shore. When they entered the anomalous zone, Kim's equipment behaved exactly as the guides had described. The depth finder readings climbed steadily, exceeding 2,000 feet before Kim shut the unit off. Kim dropped a weighted line overboard, a simple plumb line with a heavy sinker and marked intervals. The line played out to its full length, 600 feet without reaching bottom. Kim noted that the line went slack briefly around 400 feet, as if the weight had encountered a current or thermal layer before continuing its descent. When he retrieved the line, the sinker was missing. The line had been severed cleanly, as if cut. Kim documented his findings and submitted them to the Journal of Underwater Acoustics. The submission was rejected without review. The editor's response noted that the observations lacked sufficient institutional backing and recommended Kim work with an established research organization. Kim contacted the USGS and requested access to the original 1992 survey data. His request was denied. The USGS stated that the data was part of an ongoing study and could not be released. In 2001, a private environmental consulting firm hired by the Quinault Indian Nation conducted a water quality assessment of Lake Quinault. The firm's survey included limited sonar work. When the team approached the eastern shore, their equipment registered the same anomalous depths. The firm's project manager, a geologist named Angela Martinez, mentioned the findings in her preliminary report. The Quinault Nation's Natural Resources Department asked her to remove the reference, stating that it was not relevant to water quality objectives. Martinez complied. The final report made no mention of unusual depth readings. A second USGS survey was conducted in 2004, this time using more advanced multi-beam sonar capable of penetrating turbid water. The survey was classified upon completion. When questioned by a local newspaper, a USGS spokesperson stated that the data contained sensitive geological information and would not be made public. No further explanation was provided. Commercial guides still avoid the eastern shore of Lake Quinault. The area is not marked on tourist maps, and most visitors remain unaware of its existence. Occasionally, a recreational boater will drift into the zone and experience the same phenomenon, depth finders displaying readings that plunge into impossible depths, equipment behaving erratically, and an instinctive unease that prompts them to move back toward open water. The Quinault Indian Nation does not discuss the anomaly publicly. Tribal elders maintain that certain places in the lake are not meant to be measured or understood. When asked directly, they decline to elaborate, offering only the suggestion that some depths are older than the lake itself. Dr. Patel left the USGS in 2009. In a private conversation recorded by a colleague, she stated that she believed her survey had detected something genuine, a geological feature or subterranean void that defied conventional explanation. She also noted that she had been discouraged from pursuing further research and that the classification of subsequent surveys suggested institutional awareness of something they preferred to leave unexamined. The lake remains. The eastern shore remains. And beneath the dark water, in a place where sonar signals vanish and weighted lines come back severed, something continues to pull downward into a depth that cartographers insist does not exist. For 17 minutes every October, something returns to work the night shift. Forks sits on the western edge of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, a logging town of roughly 3,000 people surrounded by dense temperate rainforest. The town grew rapidly in the early 20th century as timber companies harvested old-growth forests throughout the region. By the 1950s, Forks supported 7 active sawmills, employing nearly half the town's population. The sound of machinery ran constantly, saws cutting through cedar and Douglas fir, conveyor belts moving lumber, steam whistles marking shift changes. The Cascade Mill operated from 1947 until 1983, processing timber from the Bogachiel River Valley. It sat 2 miles south of town on a cleared plateau overlooking the Sol Duke River. The mill was one of the largest in Clallam County, running 3 shifts daily at its peak. When the timber industry contracted in the early 80s, the mill shut down abruptly. Equipment was sold for scrap, buildings were stripped of usable materials, and the site was left to decay. By 1990, only concrete foundations and rusted machinery remained. The area became a dumping ground for old appliances and construction debris. Locals avoided it, not out of superstition, but because the ground was unstable and strewn with metal hazards. The access road deteriorated into mud ruts. Blackberry vines reclaimed the clearing. The mill site was effectively abandoned, remembered only by those who had worked there decades earlier. Then, on October 9, 1996, residents began reporting lights at the old mill. The first report came from a woman named Patricia Galloway, who lived on the southern outskirts of Forks. Galloway was 57 years old, a retired school teacher who had moved to the area in 1974. On the evening of October 9th, she was driving home from Port Angeles when she noticed lights in the direction of the old Cascade Mill site. The lights were bright, white, and steady. Not flashlights or campfires, but something resembling industrial floodlights. Galloway slowed her vehicle and watched for several minutes. The lights remained constant, illuminating what appeared to be the central mill structure. She could also hear machinery, a distant rhythmic sound like conveyor belts and hydraulic systems. Galloway checked her watch. It was 9:43 p.m. She continued driving home and mentioned the incident to her husband, who dismissed it as teenagers or salvage workers. 2 nights later, on October 11th, a man named Raymond Kowalczyk reported the same phenomenon. Kowalczyk had worked at the Cascade Mill from 1968 until its closure and lived within a mile of the site. He was outside smoking on his porch when he heard the unmistakable sound of the mill in operation. Saws cutting, machinery humming, steam venting. He walked toward the site but stopped at the tree line. The lights were there just as Galloway had described. Kowalczyk noted the time, 9:41 p.m. The sounds and lights continued for exactly 17 minutes. At 9:58 p.m., everything stopped. The lights went dark. The machinery noise ceased abruptly. Kowalczyk stood in silence, listening to the forest return to its normal stillness. He returned home and called the Clallam County Sheriff's Office the next morning. Deputy Sheriff Alan Briggs investigated the reports on October 12th. Briggs drove to the mill site during daylight and found it as expected, overgrown, abandoned, with no signs of recent activity, no tire tracks, no footprints, no evidence of electrical equipment or generators. He returned that evening at 9:30 p.m. and waited in his vehicle with the engine off. At 9:42 p.m., the lights appeared. Briggs described them later as industrial work lights, the kind mounted on poles at construction sites. They illuminated the foundations and skeletal remains of the main building. He could hear machinery, distinct mechanical sounds that reminded him of recordings he had heard of old sawmills. Briggs stepped out of his vehicle with a flashlight and approached the site on foot. The lights did not cast shadows the way normal lights should. Briggs could see the illuminated structures clearly, but when he shone his flashlight into the lit areas, his beam passed through without obstruction. He walked to within 50 feet of the central foundation. The machinery sounds were louder now, surrounding him, but he could see nothing that would produce them. No equipment, no movement, just sound and light, with no visible source. At 9:59 p.m., everything stopped. Briggs checked his watch and noted the duration, 17 minutes. He remained at the site for another hour, but nothing further occurred. He filed a report with the sheriff's office the following day, describing the incident as unexplained auditory and visual phenomena, and recommending further investigation. A second deputy, Maria Santos, joined Briggs on October 14th. They set up infrared cameras and audio recording equipment at multiple points around the mill site. At 9:41 p.m., the phenomenon began. The infrared cameras captured heat signatures, dozens of them, arranged in formations consistent with workers moving through an industrial space. The signatures showed human-sized thermal profiles engaged in coordinated activity. But when Santos and Briggs moved into the areas where the signatures appeared, they encountered nothing. No people, no machinery, only empty air. The audio recorders captured 17 minutes of mechanical noise, saws, conveyors, hydraulic presses, and occasional human voices shouting over the din. The voices were indistinct, muffled by the surrounding machinery sounds, but clearly human. A forensic audio analyst later reviewed the recordings and identified at least 8 different male voices, all speaking English in what sounded like work-related communication. The sheriff's office contacted the Washington State Patrol on October 16th, requesting technical assistance. A team of investigators arrived with advanced recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, and ground-penetrating radar. They set up observation posts around the mill site and waited. The phenomenon occurred again on October 18th at 9:42 p.m. The investigative team documented 17 minutes of lights and machinery sounds. The electromagnetic field detectors registered unusual spikes during the event, but the readings were inconsistent and localized to specific areas of the site. The ground-penetrating radar showed no anomalies in the soil or subsurface structures. One investigator, a state patrol sergeant named Thomas Reeves, attempted to record video during the event. His camera malfunctioned when the lights appeared, displaying only static. A backup camera performed normally but captured nothing unusual. The viewfinder showed the darkened mill site as it appeared without the lights and sounds. Yet Reeves, standing directly beside the camera, could see and hear the phenomenon clearly with his own eyes and ears. A physicist from the University of Washington, Dr. Linda Fitzgerald, was invited to observe on October 20th. Fitzgerald specialized in acoustic phenomena and brought sensitive audio equipment designed to isolate sound sources. During the 17-minute window, her equipment recorded the machinery sounds but could not triangulate their origin. The audio appeared to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, as if the entire site were generating sound without a point source. Fitzgerald described the experience in a later interview. "I've studied acoustic anomalies for 15 years. This was unlike anything I'd encountered. The sounds were real, measurable, recordable, but they violated basic principles of sound propagation. There was no source, no mechanical system producing the noise, just the noise itself, existing independently." The phenomenon was observed 6 more times in October of 1996, always beginning between 9:41 and 9:43 p.m., and lasting exactly 17 minutes. On November 1st, investigators returned to the site at the expected time. Nothing occurred, the site remained dark and silent. Subsequent observations in November, December, and throughout 1997 yielded no further events. In October of 1997, the lights and sounds returned. Same time, same duration, same patterns. This time, fewer witnesses reported it. The sheriff's office logged the incidents but did not conduct formal investigations. By October of 1998, the phenomenon had become a known but unspoken part of Fork's local experience, acknowledged by those who had witnessed it but rarely discussed openly. The Cascade Mill site was purchased by a timber company in 2001. The new owners cleared the remaining debris and replanted the area with second-growth Douglas fir. The concrete foundations were buried under soil and vegetation. Within 5 years, the site was indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. The phenomenon continues. Every October, during a 17-minute window near 9:45 p.m., residents in South Forks report lights and machinery sounds from the direction of the old mill. The sounds have been recorded dozens of times. The lights have been photographed, though the images show only darkness when developed. Infrared cameras still capture heat signatures arranged in working formations, moving through spaces that no longer exist. No official explanation has been offered. The sheriff's office maintains a file on the incidents, but conducts no active investigation. The State Patrol closed its case in 2003, citing insufficient evidence to determine cause. Dr. Fitzgerald published a paper on the phenomenon in 2005, documenting the acoustic recordings and thermal data. The paper was accepted by a journal specializing in unexplained phenomena, but largely ignored by mainstream scientific publications. Kowalczyk, the former mill worker, passed away in 2009. Before his death, he told a local journalist that he recognized some of the voices in the recordings, men he had worked alongside 40 years earlier, men who were long dead. The journalist asked if he found this disturbing. Kowalczyk said no. "They're just finishing their shift," he said, "same as they always did." The forest has reclaimed the mill site entirely now. But every October for 17 minutes, the trees echo with the sound of work that never stops, lights that illuminate nothing, and the thermal shadows of workers who clocked out decades ago but never quite left. The letters arrived for 3 years from a place that was never built. The Quinault Indian Reservation occupies the southwestern corner of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, spanning nearly 200,000 acres of coastal rainforest, river valleys, and Pacific shoreline. The reservation was established by treaty in 1855 and expanded in 1989 to include additional ancestral lands. The Quinault people have inhabited the region for thousands of years, maintaining cultural traditions deeply connected to the forest, rivers, and ocean. Queets is a small unincorporated community on the reservation's northern edge, situated where the Queets River meets the Pacific Ocean. The area is remote. The nearest town of any size, Forks, lies 23 miles north. A single 2-lane highway provides access, winding through dense forest where cell phone service is non-existent and fog settles for weeks at a time during winter months. The Queets Post Office has operated since 1931, serving fewer than 100 residents scattered across miles of coastline and river valley. In the 1960s, the post office was housed in a one-room building adjacent to the community's general store. Mail arrived 3 times weekly by truck from Aberdeen, sorted by a single postmaster who also managed the store. Outgoing mail was collected in a canvas bag and returned on the same truck. The system was simple, reliable, and largely unchanged since its establishment. The Postal Service maintained meticulous records. Every piece of mail passing through Queets was logged, postmarked, and tracked. Discrepancies were rare and immediately noticed, which is why the letters to the Quinault Tribal Council were so disturbing. The first letter arrived on March 14, 1967. It was addressed to the Quinault Indian Nation Tribal Council, care of the reservation's administrative office in Tohola, 15 miles south of Queets. The envelope was standard white stationery, hand-addressed, in precise cursive script. The postmark read Queets, W.A., with a date stamp of March 12, 1967. The stamp was a 5-cent Washington Territory Centennial Commemorative, issued in 1953. The letter was opened by a tribal administrator named Joseph Whitecomb, who managed correspondence for the council. Inside was a single page of handwritten text and unlined paper. The letter began, "Greetings from Mora's End. Spring has arrived early this year, and the fishing boats returned yesterday with a fine catch of silver salmon." The letter continued for 2 paragraphs, describing daily life in what appeared to be a small coastal village. It mentioned specific details, weather patterns, fishing conditions, the construction of a new community hall, and preparations for a summer gathering. It was signed Eleanor Mora, Village Correspondent. There was no return address. Whitecomb found the letter unusual, but not alarming. He assumed it was misdirected mail intended for another tribal community, or a confused attempt at communication from someone unfamiliar with the reservation's structure. He filed it without response. 3 weeks later, on April 5th, a second letter arrived, same handwriting, same postmark from Queets, same stamp, a 5-cent Washington Territory Centennial from 1953, despite those stamps having been out of circulation for over a decade. This letter described the completion of the community hall and mentioned several residents by name: Thomas Barrington, Sarah Yates, Michael Kowalski. It noted that the spring storms had been mild and that new families were expected to arrive from the east before summer. Whitecomb brought the letters to the attention of the Tribal Council chairman, a man named Daniel Underwood. Underwood had lived on the reservation his entire life and knew every village, settlement, and family name within Quinault territory. He had never heard of Mora's End. He had never heard of Eleanor Mora, Thomas Barrington, Sarah Yates, or Michael Kowalski. Over the next 2 years, 32 more letters arrived. They came irregularly, sometimes 2 in a month, sometimes none for 6 weeks, but always postmarked from Queets and always written in the same careful script. Each letter described life in Mora's End with mundane specificity: weather, fishing yields, births, deaths, community events. The village, according to the letters, was located along the coastal bluffs north of the river mouth, a location that would place it somewhere between Queets and the Hoh River. Underwood drove to that section of coast in May of 1967. He found no village, no structures, no roads or trails suggesting recent habitation. The area was dense coastal forest transitioning to rocky beach, inaccessible except by foot and largely unchanged for generations. He spoke with elders who had lived near Queets for 70 years. None remembered a settlement called Mora's End. None recognized the names mentioned in the letters. A tribal council member named Victoria Santos suggested the letters might be an elaborate hoax. But certain details troubled her. The descriptions of weather patterns in the letters matched historical meteorological records for the Queets area with uncanny accuracy. References to salmon runs aligned with actual fishing reports. A letter dated September 9, 1968, mentioned unseasonable storms arriving from the southwest, which corresponded precisely to a documented storm system that struck the coast on September 8th and 9th. In December of 1968, Underwood contacted the United States Postal Service. He provided copies of the letters and requested an investigation. A postal inspector named Frank Delgado traveled to Queets in January of 1969 to examine the case. Delgado interviewed the postmaster, a man named Harold Nguyen, who had operated the Queets post office since 1962. Nguyen confirmed that all the letters had passed through his facility. He recognized the envelopes and postmarks, but he had no memory of processing them. "I see every piece of mail that comes through here," Nguyen told Delgado. "I would remember letters like these. I would remember someone bringing them in, but I don't." Delgado examined the physical letters. The stamps were genuine, authenticated by Postal Service experts as legitimate Washington Territory Centennial issues from 1953. But they had been affixed to envelopes and postmarked in 1967 through 1969, years after they should have been available. The postmarks themselves were authentic, created by the official Queets postal stamp, which Nguyen kept locked in his office. The handwriting was analyzed by a forensic document examiner in Seattle. The examiner, Dr. Patricia O'Neill, compared the letters to samples of cursive writing from the 1940s and 50s. She determined that the script was consistent with formal penmanship instruction common in the early 20th century. She also noted that the writer showed signs of advanced age, slight tremors in certain strokes, careful deliberation in letter formation. In March of 1969, Underwood received the final letter. It was dated March 1, 1969, and postmarked March 3 from Queets. The letter was shorter than previous correspondence, only a single paragraph. "The last families departed yesterday by boat. The village stands empty now, as it must. We have honored the old agreements and kept our promises to those who came before. Mora's End returns to silence. May those who follow remember that some places are markers, not homes." It was signed, as always, Eleanor Mora, village correspondent. Delgado expanded his investigation. He contacted the Washington State Archives to search for any historical record of Mora's End or Eleanor Mora. The archives contained no references to either. He reviewed tribal land records, missionary journals, explorer accounts, and settler diaries from the 1800s. Nothing. Then, in April of 1969, a librarian at the University of Washington discovered something. Buried in a collection of personal papers donated by a descendant of early Washington settlers was a diary entry from 1897. The entry mentioned a coastal settlement called Mora's End, being established by a group of families north of Queets. The settlement was noted as temporary and intended to serve as a way station for travelers moving between coastal communities. Further research revealed a single census record from 1900 listing 17 individuals residing in a place called Mora's End, Queets District. Among them was a woman named Eleanor Mora, age 23. The 1910 census showed no such location. The settlement appeared to have been abandoned within a decade of its founding. Delgado requested handwriting samples from the 1900 census records. Eleanor Mora had signed her census form. The signature was a match. The handwriting in the letters, written between 1967 and 1969, belonged to a woman who would have been 90 years old in 1967 if she had lived that long. Death records showed Eleanor Mora died in Seattle on November 7, 1944, at age 67. She was buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Her obituary made no mention of Queets or Mora's End, Wate. The postal investigation closed in June of 1969 without conclusion. Delgado's report noted the impossibility of the correspondence, the stamps that shouldn't exist, the handwriting from a deceased woman, the postmarks that no one remembered creating, but offered no explanation. The report was filed and forgotten. The letters remain in the Quinault Tribal Council archives, stored in a fireproof cabinet in Tahola. Researchers occasionally request to examine them. The requests are usually denied. Tribal elders prefer the letters remain undisturbed, citing cultural protocols about communicating with those who have passed. No one has determined how the letters were mailed. No one has explained the stamps. No one has found Mora's End, though some say the forest along the northern coastal bluffs feels different in certain weather, heavier, older, as if the trees remember something humans forgot. And in Queets, the post office still operates, processing mail 3 times weekly. Harold and Gwynn retired in 1992. His successor mentioned once, off the record, that certain letters pass through the facility without anyone handling them. They simply appear in the outgoing bag, correctly sorted, properly postmarked, ready to continue to wherever they're going, or wherever they've been. Sometimes the trail knows where you're going before you do. The Solduke Falls Trail is one of the most popular hiking routes in Olympic National Park. A relatively easy 0.8-mile walk through old-growth forest to a viewing platform overlooking a rushing waterfall. The trail receives over 100,000 visitors annually, drawing families, photographers, and casual hikers seeking accessible wilderness experience. The path is well maintained, clearly marked, and considered entirely safe by park standards. The Solduke River originates high in the Olympic Mountains, fed by glacial melt and winter snowpack. By the time it reaches the falls, the river has carved a narrow gorge through ancient rock, plunging over a series of cascades into pools 50 feet below. The surrounding forest is dense with Douglas fir, western hemlock, and Sitka spruce, some exceeding 200 feet in height. Moss covers nearly every surface. The air stays damp year-round, thick with the smell of decay and growth occurring simultaneously. The area has been sacred to the Quileute people for centuries. Their oral histories describe the Solduke as a boundary river, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersect. Elders speak of paths that appear and disappear, of travelers who walk in 2 directions at once, of the forest remembering journeys that haven't yet been taken. The National Park Service has maintained detailed incident reports for the Solduke area since the park's establishment in 1938. Most entries document routine events, minor injuries, lost personal items, occasional wildlife encounters. But buried within these records are references to something else. Hikers reporting boot prints that shouldn't exist, trails that seem to shift position, and the persistent sense of being followed by someone who walks ahead. The first documented case occurred in July of 1997. A woman named Rebecca Sutton was hiking the Solduke Falls Trail with her husband on the morning of July 15, 1997. Sutton was 34 years old, an experienced hiker from Portland, Oregon, who had visited Olympic National Park many times. The weather was clear, the trail was moderately crowded with several families and couples visible ahead and behind. Approximately halfway to the falls, Sutton noticed boot prints in a muddy section of trail. The prints were fresh, clearly defined, and matched the tread pattern of her own hiking boots, a distinctive Vibram sole she had purchased specifically for the trip. She pointed them out to her husband Daniel, who confirmed they looked identical to hers, but the prints were ahead of them, leading forward along the trail. Sutton and her husband continued walking. They reached the falls, spent 20 minutes at the viewing platform, and returned along the same path. When they passed the muddy section again, Sutton's prints were there as expected, but only the ones they had just made walking toward the falls. The earlier prints, the ones that had been ahead of them, were gone. Sutton mentioned the incident to a park ranger at the trailhead. The ranger, whose name was not recorded in the incident log, suggested the prints had belonged to another hiker wearing similar boots. Sutton accepted this explanation, but remained unsettled. She was certain the tread pattern had been identical, down to specific wear marks on the heel. Similar reports emerged sporadically over the next 6 years. In August of 1998, a man named Gregory Walsh reported finding his own boot prints on a side trail, branching from the main Solduke path. The prince led into unmarked forest for roughly 200 yards before disappearing at the base of a large cedar tree. Walsh had not walked that direction. In October of 2000, a couple reported seeing their prints on a trail section they had not yet reached, only to watch the prints fade as they approached, as if the mud itself was erasing them. The National Park Service logged these incidents, but conducted no formal investigation. The reports were classified as misidentifications or confusion caused by the large number of hikers using the trail. Rangers were instructed to reassure visitors and redirect concerns toward more conventional explanations. Then, in June of 2003, something happened that could not be explained away. A solo hiker named Marcus Thibodeau set out on the Solduc Falls Trail at 7:30 a.m. on June 12, 2003. Thibodeau was 41 years old, a geology professor from Seattle who frequently hiked Olympic National Park while conducting field research. He was familiar with the area and carried a GPS unit, a camera, and a detailed topographical map. Shortly after leaving the trailhead, Thibodeau noticed boot prints ahead of him, his own prints, identifiable by the unique tread pattern and a distinctive scrape on the left sole caused by a climbing accident years earlier. The prints were in soft mud near a creek crossing. They led forward along the trail, deeper into the forest. Thibodeau stopped and examined the prints carefully. He photographed them with a digital camera, noting the timestamp, 7:43 a.m. He looked behind him. His own tracks were clearly visible in the mud where he had just walked, but the prints ahead were identical, same boots, same gait pattern, same scrape on the left sole. He continued following the trail. The prints remained visible intermittently wherever the ground was soft. Mud, damp soil, patches of moss. Thibodeau marked his GPS position repeatedly, documenting his route. The prints stayed ahead of him, sometimes by a few yards, sometimes by 50 feet, always leading forward. At 8:20 a.m., Thibodeau passed the junction where the main trail split toward Solduc Falls. His prints continued, straight, following a less traveled path that led deeper into the backcountry. Thibodeau had intended to visit the falls and return, but he felt compelled to follow the prints. He told investigators later that it seemed important, though he could not articulate why. He tracked the prints for 4.7 miles, documenting the route with GPS coordinates and photographs. The prints never deviated. They crossed streams, climbed over fallen logs, and navigated sections of trail that were barely visible beneath forest undergrowth. At 10:15 a.m., the prints led to a stream crossing where they entered the water and did not emerge on the opposite bank. Thibodeau stood at the stream's edge, uncertain what to do. He decided to return to the main trail and report the incident. He turned around and began walking back the way he had come. 10 minutes later, he encountered himself. A National Park Service ranger named Sandra Martinez was conducting a routine patrol of the Solduc Falls Trail when she encountered Thibodeau walking toward the trailhead at approximately 10:45 a.m. Martinez asked if he had completed his hike. Thibodeau appeared confused and asked what she meant. He said he had just started hiking less than an hour ago and was heading toward the falls. Martinez noticed that Thibodeau looked tired and his boots were covered in mud. She asked him to confirm his start time. Thibodeau checked his watch and said he had begun hiking at 7:30 a.m. It was now 10:45 a.m. More than 3 hours had passed. Martinez radioed the ranger station and requested assistance. 2 additional rangers arrived within 20 minutes. One of them, a man named Kevin O'Brien, asked Thibodeau to describe his route. Thibodeau insisted he had followed the main trail, taken no side paths, and remembered nothing unusual. He could not explain the mud on his boots or the time discrepancy. O'Brien asked Thibodeau if he was carrying a GPS unit. Thibodeau checked his pack and found the device. When O'Brien examined the GPS track log, it showed that Thibodeau had traveled 4.7 miles beyond the main trail junction, following a route that matched exactly the path the boot prints had taken. The log included timestamps documenting the entire journey, but Thibodeau had no memory of it. Martinez and O'Brien decided to retrace the GPS route. They asked Thibodeau to wait at the ranger station while they investigated. The two rangers, accompanied by a search and rescue volunteer named Lisa Kowalski, followed the coordinates into the backcountry. They found Thibodeau's boot prints exactly where the GPS log indicated. Fresh tracks leading deep into the forest, crossing streams, navigating unmarked terrain. The prints ended at the stream where Thibodeau's GPS log stopped recording. The rangers photographed the prints and collected soil samples from several locations. They also found something unusual. At multiple points along the route, there were two sets of identical boot prints, one set older and partially degraded, one set fresh. The older prints appeared to have been made hours or even days earlier, though Thibodeau had no history of hiking that specific route. The National Park Service opened an investigation on June 13, 2003. Thibodeau was interviewed extensively by park officials and a medical evaluator. He showed no signs of head injury, disorientation, or psychological distress. His GPS device was examined by a technical specialist who confirmed the track log was accurate and had not been tampered with. The photographs Thibodeau had taken were analyzed and matched the locations documented in the GPS log. A cognitive psychologist from the University of Washington, Dr. Ellen Ramirez, was consulted to evaluate whether Thibodeau might have experienced a dissociative episode or fugue state. Ramirez concluded that while such conditions could explain memory loss, they did not account for the presence of two sets of boot prints or the fact that Thibodeau encountered his own tracks before walking the route that created them. The Park Service attempted to explain the incident as a coincidence. Perhaps another hiker wearing identical boots had walked the same path earlier that day. But analysis of the boot tread showed unique wear patterns that matched Thibodeau's boots exactly, including the distinctive scrape on the left sole. The probability of two hikers wearing identically worn boots and walking the same unmarked route was considered statistically impossible. In August of 2003, the investigation was quietly closed. The official report classified the incident as unexplained navigational anomaly and recommended no further action. The report was filed in park archives and marked as restricted access. When Thibodeau requested a copy of the report in 2005, his request was denied under exemptions related to ongoing investigations, despite the case having been closed 2 years earlier. The Sol Duc Falls Trail remains one of the most popular hiking destinations in Olympic National Park. Rangers no longer log reports of unusual boot prints, though hikers continue to mention them occasionally. Most are dismissed as coincidence or misperception. Thibodeau returned to the trail once, in 2007, accompanied by a colleague. He walked to the junction where his prints had diverged 4 years earlier. The path into the backcountry was still there, overgrown but visible. He did not follow it. He told his colleague that he sometimes dreams about the stream crossing, the place where his prints entered the water and never came out. In the dreams, he crosses the stream and continues walking forward, following prints that lead him deeper into the forest toward a destination he has already reached but does not remember. The Park Service no longer discusses the incident officially, but some rangers, when asked off the record, will mention that certain trails in Olympic National Park behave differently than others. They will say that the forest remembers things, routes traveled, journeys taken, paths walked by people who have not yet arrived, and they will advise hikers to pay attention to their own footprints, because sometimes the trail decides where you're going, and Sometimes it brings you back from places you never consciously went. Something beneath the Pacific was counting time in a language humans could measure but not understand. The Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary extends along 84 miles of Washington state coastline, encompassing over 3,000 square miles of marine environment. The waters range from shallow tide pools to abyssal depths exceeding 3,000 feet. The seafloor topography is complex: underwater canyons, seamounts, and continental shelf breaks, creating one of the most geologically active marine regions in the Pacific Northwest. The sanctuary was established in 1994 to protect diverse marine ecosystems, including kelp forests, deep-sea coral reefs, and critical habitat for endangered species. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration maintains a network of monitoring stations throughout the sanctuary, collecting data on water temperature, salinity, current patterns, and seismic activity. These stations operate continuously, transmitting data via satellite to research facilities in Seattle and La Jolla. The region sits above the Cascadia subduction zone, where the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate slides beneath the North American plate at a rate of approximately 1.5 inches per year. This geological process generates frequent minor earthquakes and poses the risk of a catastrophic megathrust earthquake, an event that last occurred in 1700, producing a tsunami that reached Japan. Scientists monitor the subduction zone closely, tracking even subtle changes in seafloor pressure and seismic activity. The monitoring network detected those changes, but what it recorded in 2008 was not seismic. It was something else entirely. On March 7, 2008, a pressure sensor located 43 miles offshore from Cape Flattery registered an anomaly. The sensor, designated Station 7 Alpha, was anchored at a depth of 2,100 feet on the edge of the continental shelf. Its primary function was to detect pressure variations associated with underwater landslides, tectonic shifts, and tsunami precursors. At 1400 hours Pacific time, the sensor recorded a pressure increase of 0.03 bar, a subtle change but measurable. The increase lasted 11 minutes, then returned to baseline. 6 hours later, at 2000 hours, the pattern repeated. Same magnitude, same duration. The cycle continued every 6 hours, 0200 hours, 0800 hours, 1400 hours, 2000 hours. Dr. Angela Martinez, an oceanographer with NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, noticed the pattern during routine data review on March 10th. Martinez had been analyzing sanctuary monitoring data for 7 years and was familiar with normal pressure variations caused by tides, storms, and geological activity. The pattern at Station 7 Alpha was different. It was too regular, too precise. Martinez cross-referenced the data with tide tables, weather reports, and seismic records. The pressure changes did not correlate with any known natural phenomena. They occurred regardless of tidal cycles, storm systems, or lunar phases. The pulses maintained their 6-hour interval with an accuracy of less than 2 seconds of variance. She contacted her supervisor, Dr. Kenneth Okoye, on March 12th. Okoye reviewed the data and agreed the pattern was unusual. He suggested it might be a sensor malfunction or calibration error. Martinez ran diagnostics on Station 7 Alpha remotely. The sensor was functioning normally. All calibration parameters were within acceptable ranges. On March 15th, Martinez requested access to data from adjacent monitoring stations. Station 6 Bravo, located 8 miles northeast of 7 Alpha, showed no anomalies. Station 8 Charlie, 6 miles southwest, showed identical pressure pulses beginning on March 7th. Same magnitude, same timing, synchronized perfectly with 7 Alpha. The pattern was expanding. By March 25th, 5 monitoring stations within a 12-mile radius of Station 7 Alpha were registering the pressure pulses. Martinez documented the phenomenon in a technical report submitted to NOAA headquarters in Seattle. She noted that the affected area formed a roughly circular zone centered on coordinates 48 degrees north, 125 degrees west, a location in open ocean approximately 50 miles from the nearest land. Dr. Okoye forwarded Martinez's report to the U.S. Geological Survey's Earthquake Hazards Program, suggesting the pressure changes might indicate precursor activity to a seismic event. A seismologist named Dr. Patricia Holloway reviewed the data and concluded that the pattern was inconsistent with pre-earthquake phenomena. Tectonic stress builds irregularly, Holloway wrote in her assessment. This is metronomic. It's not geological. In April of 2008, NOAA deployed a research vessel, the Oscar Dyson, to investigate the anomaly site. The ship carried advanced sonar equipment, seafloor mapping tools, and remotely operated vehicles capable of descending to depths of 4,000 feet. The mission was led by Dr. Raymond Kowalski, a marine geophysicist with 20 years of deep ocean research experience. The Oscar Dyson arrived at the coordinates on April 14th. The crew conducted multi-beam sonar surveys of the sea floor and deployed a remotely operated vehicle to inspect the area visually. The sonar revealed nothing unusual, standard continental shelf topography with sediment-covered rock formations. The remotely operated vehicle captured video footage of typical deep-sea environment, silt, scattered boulders, occasional sea life. No structural anomalies, no evidence of human activity or equipment. Yet the pressure pulses continued. The ship's own instruments detected them, synchronized with the monitoring stations. Kowalski described the experience in a recorded interview conducted months later. We were sitting directly above the source, or what we thought was the source. The sensors showed pressure changes occurring below us, but there was nothing there. No vents, no geological activity, no mechanical systems, just empty ocean floor pulsing like a heartbeat. The Oscar Dyson remained on station for 8 days, collecting data continuously. The crew deployed additional sensors at varying depths to triangulate the source of the pressure changes. The results were contradictory. Some sensors indicated the pulses originated from the seafloor. Others suggested they came from deeper, far deeper than the ocean floor itself, as if emanating from within the bedrock or the subduction zone beneath. Kowalski contacted the Navy's Pacific Fleet headquarters on April 21st, requesting information about any submarine activity or underwater equipment in the area. The Navy confirmed that no U.S. submarines were operating within 100 miles of the sanctuary during the relevant period. Kowalski asked if foreign vessels might be responsible. The Navy declined to comment but noted that the depth and location made covert submarine operations highly unlikely. A hydroacoustic specialist from the University of Washington, Dr. Linda Fitzgerald, joined the Oscar Dyson on April 23rd. Fitzgerald brought sensitive listening equipment designed to detect low-frequency underwater sounds. She deployed hydrophone arrays at depths ranging from 500 to 3,000 feet. The arrays detected faint acoustic emissions coinciding with the pressure pulses, low-frequency sounds below 20 Hz, barely within the range of human hearing if amplified. Fitzgerald analyzed the recordings and identified a pattern within the sounds. It wasn't random noise, she explained in a later interview. There was structure, repetition, almost like communication. But if it was communication, it was using a syntax we don't recognize, operating on timescales that don't match human perception. The pressure pulses continued throughout May, June, and July. The affected area did not expand beyond the initial 12-mile radius. NOAA established a permanent monitoring protocol, designating the site as a research priority. Martinez compiled weekly reports documenting the phenomenon's consistency. Scientists from multiple institutions requested access to the data. Theories proliferated: tectonic precursors, underwater volcanic activity, biological sources such as whale pods producing coordinated sounds, mechanical equipment from decommissioned military installations. None of the theories adequately explained the evidence. On August 6, 2008, the Navy announced a routine reassignment of 3 Los Angeles-class attack submarines from the Pacific Fleet. The submarines, USS Tucson, USS Columbia, and USS Santa Fe, were transferred from patrol duties in the Eastern Pacific to operational assignments in the Atlantic. The reassignments were described as standard fleet rotation and received minimal media coverage. That same day, at 1400 hours Pacific time, the pressure pulses stopped. Martinez was monitoring data in real time when the change occurred. The pattern that had continued uninterrupted for 5 months simply ceased. Station 7 Alpha recorded normal baseline pressure. So did all other affected monitoring stations. Martinez waited for the next cycle at 2000 hours. Nothing. She waited through the night. The pulses did not resume. She contacted Kowalski, who was back at his office in Seattle. Kowalski accessed the data remotely and confirmed the cessation. He immediately requested that the Oscar Dyson return to the site for follow-up investigation. The request was denied by NOAA headquarters without explanation. Kowalski submitted a formal appeal. The appeal was acknowledged but not approved. On August 15th, Martinez received a directive from NOAA instructing her to archive all data related to the Olympic Coast pressure anomaly and discontinue active monitoring. The directive stated that the phenomenon was concluded and that resources should be redirected to other research priorities. Martinez complied but requested clarification on what had caused the pulses and why they stopped. She received no response. Kowalski attempted to publish a paper on the phenomenon in the Journal of Geophysical Research in September of 2008. The paper was rejected. The editor's comments noted that without a conclusive explanation for the pressure changes, publication was not warranted. Kowalski revised the paper and submitted it to 2 other journals. Both rejected it with similar reasoning. Dr. Fitzgerald mentioned the acoustic recordings in a presentation at an oceanography conference in October of 2008. During the question period, a man in the audience, who did not identify himself or his affiliation, asked if Fitzgerald had shared the recordings with any military or intelligence agencies. Fitzgerald said she had not. The man suggested that certain research findings might be subject to national security considerations and that discretion was advisable. He left before the session concluded. The monitoring stations continue to operate in the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. They transmit data continuously, recording tides, temperatures, seismic tremors, and the normal rhythms of the Pacific. Station 7 Alpha functions without issue, detecting nothing unusual since August of 2008. The reassignment of the 3 submarines was never explained beyond standard fleet rotation. The Navy declined multiple Freedom of Information Act requests for operational details related to the reassignments, citing classified information exemptions. Naval analysts who spoke off the record suggested the moves were not routine, but offered no additional context. Martinez left NOAA in 2011, accepting a position with a private environmental consulting firm. In a rare interview conducted years later, she stated, "We detected something real. It was measured by multiple instruments over months. It showed patterns that suggested intentionality or purpose. Then it stopped exactly when military assets were moved, and we were told to drop it. That's not science. That's something else." The data remains archived in NOAA servers, accessible only with special authorization. Requests to review the Olympic Coast Pressure Anomaly data are rarely approved. The official position is that the phenomenon was a sensor artifact or unidentified geological process that self-resolved. But those who monitored it, who listened to the recordings, who watched the pressure cycles repeat with inhuman precision for 5 months, do not believe that explanation. They believe something was down there, communicating or measuring or counting in a rhythm that coincided perfectly with patterns the Navy recognized and decided to respond to. And they wonder if the pulses stopped because whatever was generating them finished what it was doing, or simply because it knew someone was finally listening. The dead were named first, and the living followed years later. Port Angeles sits on the northern edge of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, a city of roughly 20,000 people facing the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The region was settled by European Americans in the 1850s, though the S'Klallam people had inhabited the area for thousands of years before that. The town grew slowly, supported by logging, fishing, and its position as the largest deep-water harbor between Seattle and Canada. 3 miles west of the city center, along a dirt road that becomes impassable during heavy rain, sits an unmarked cemetery. Local records refer to it as the Ridgeview Cemetery, though no signs identify it as such. The site occupies roughly 2 acres of cleared land on a hillside overlooking the strait. Most of the graves date from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, marking the deaths of early settlers, loggers, and their families. The cemetery fell into disuse by the 1920s as newer burial grounds opened closer to town. By the 1950s, it was largely forgotten, maintained only by occasional volunteers who cleared blackberry vines and repaired fallen headstones. The cemetery contains approximately 140 graves. Most are weathered limestone or granite markers bearing simple inscriptions, names, dates, occasionally a brief sentiment. Many are illegible after a century of exposure to coastal weather. The site is not listed on tourist maps. Few residents of Port Angeles visit it, and fewer still know its history in detail. In 1997, a genealogist named Victoria Santos was researching her family history when she discovered something impossible in the cemetery's records. Santos was 43 years old, a librarian from Seattle who had traced her maternal lineage back to the Olympic Peninsula in the 1880s. Her great-great-grandmother, Martha Kowalski, had emigrated from Poland and settled near Port Angeles in 1883. Santos was attempting to locate Martha's grave and any other family members who might be buried in the region. She obtained a copy of the Ridgeview Cemetery records from the S'Klallam County Historical Society in May of 1997. The records consisted of a handwritten ledger dating from 1887 to 1923, documenting each burial with a name, date of death, and plot number. While reviewing the ledger, Santos noticed something strange. 11 graves, all dated between 1889 and 1906, bore names that seemed familiar. She cross-referenced them with contemporary Port Angeles phone directories and public records. The names matched living residents. Not similar names, exact matches, including middle initials. One grave, dated March 7, 1892, was marked Thomas J. Whitfield. A man named Thomas J. Whitfield lived in Port Angeles. In 1997, working as a fisherman, Santos checked birth records. The living Thomas J. Whitfield was born in 1963. Another grave, dated October 14, 1898, read, Eleanor M. Underwood. A woman named Eleanor M. Underwood resided in Port Angeles, a retired school teacher. She was born in 1947. Santos documented 11 such matches. Each grave bore a name that appeared in 20th century birth records decades after the person buried in the grave had died. The names were not common ones that might be explained by coincidence. They included unusual surnames and specific middle initials that made random duplication highly unlikely. Santos visited the cemetery on June 3, 1997. She located each of the 11 graves and photographed the headstones. The markers were weathered but legible, showing death dates consistent with the ledger. She also noted that all 11 graves were clustered in a specific section of the cemetery, occupying 2 adjacent rows near the western boundary. Santos contacted the living individuals whose names matched the graves. She reached 5 of them by phone, explaining her research and asking if they knew of any family connection to the cemetery or the names on the headstones. The responses were uniformly evasive. Thomas J. Whitfield, the fisherman, hung up immediately after Santos mentioned the grave. When she called back, his wife answered and said he would not discuss the matter. Santos asked why. The wife said only, "We don't talk about the names. It's an old agreement." Eleanor M. Underwood, the retired teacher, was more forthcoming but no less cryptic. She confirmed that she knew about the grave bearing her name and that her parents had known about it as well. "It's something families here understand," Underwood told Santos. "The names are borrowed. It's been that way for a long time. We don't question it." Santos asked what borrowed meant. Underwood said she could not explain further and suggested Santos stop pursuing the matter. "Some things are obligations," Underwood said. "We owe something to the peninsula, to the people who were here first. The names are part of that." A third individual, a man named Gregory Walsh, whose name matched a grave dated 1899, agreed to meet Santos in person. Walsh was 71 years old, a retired logger who had lived in Port Angeles his entire life. He met Santos at a coffee shop in town on June 10, 1997. Walsh confirmed that he knew about the grave. He said his father had taken him to the cemetery when he was a boy and shown him the headstone. "My father told me the name was waiting," Walsh said. "He said when I was born, the name was already there, in the ground, and I was given it because that's how things worked. I didn't understand then. I'm not sure I understand now." Santos asked if Walsh's family had any genealogical connection to the person buried in the grave. Walsh said no. The person in the grave was not a relative, not an ancestor, not anyone his family had known. "The name was just there," he said, "and when I was born it became mine." Walsh also mentioned that several other families in Port Angeles shared similar experiences. Children given names that matched old graves, names that seemed to be waiting. He said it was understood locally but never discussed openly. "It's private," Walsh said, "between the families and the land." Santos submitted her findings to the Washington State Genealogical Society in August of 1997, accompanied by copies of the cemetery records, photographs of the headstones, and transcripts of her interviews. The Society acknowledged receipt but declined to publish her research. The editor's note stated that the findings were intriguing but insufficiently contextualized to support extraordinary claims. Santos contacted the Clallam County Historical Society, hoping to find additional documentation about the cemetery or the families involved. A volunteer researcher named Patricia O'Neill agreed to assist. O'Neill spent several weeks reviewing historical records, newspaper archives, and county vital statistics. She found nothing to explain the name matches. However, O'Neill did discover something unusual. Birth records for the 11 living individuals whose names matched the graves all contained a notation in the margin. Registered per Peninsula Covenant, 1885. The same notation appeared in the birth records of their parents, and in some cases, their grandparents. O'Neill could find no explanation for what Peninsula Covenant referred to. No legal document, treaty, or agreement by that name existed in county archives. In September of 1997, Santos contacted the S'Klallam tribe's Cultural Resources Office, wondering if the covenant might be related to indigenous practices or agreements with early settlers. A tribal elder, whose name was not recorded at their request, agreed to speak with her off the record. The elder confirmed that the tribe was aware of the cemetery and the naming practice. They described it as a debt settlement between the first European settlers and the land itself, not the tribe, but the land. The elder explained that when the settlers arrived, they made agreements that extended beyond written treaties, agreements that involved giving back something in exchange for what they took. Names were part of that exchange. The names go into the ground first, the elder told Santos. Then they come back up. It's a cycle. The living borrow what the dead left behind. That's the agreement. If they stop honoring it, the land remembers. Santos asked what would happen if the agreement was broken. The elder said they did not know, but they suggested it was not something anyone in Port Angeles wanted to find out. Shamu. Santos attempted to publish her findings in several historical and genealogical journals between 1998 and 2000. All submissions were rejected. Editors consistently cited the lack of verifiable explanation and the anecdotal nature of witness testimony. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker from Portland named Angela Martinez contacted Santos after reading about her research on an obscure genealogy forum. Martinez proposed creating a short film about the cemetery and the name phenomenon. Santos agreed and accompanied Martinez to Port Angeles in July of 2003. Martinez interviewed 3 of the individuals whose names matched graves: Thomas Whitfield, Eleanor Underwood, and Gregory Walsh. All 3 confirmed their awareness of the graves, but refused to elaborate on camera. The interviews were brief and uncomfortable. Whitfield asked Martinez not to use his footage. Martinez honored the request. Martinez also filmed the cemetery and the 11 graves in question. When she returned to Portland and began editing the footage, she noticed something odd. In several shots of the headstones, the engraved names appeared blurred or difficult to read, despite the original footage being clear and well-focused. Martinez reshot the cemetery in August of 2003. The same blurring occurred. A camera technician examined the equipment and found no defects. Martinez abandoned the project in September of 2003. In a final email to Santos, she wrote, "I don't think this story wants to be told. Every time I tried to capture it, something pushed back. Maybe some places keep their secrets for a reason." The Ridgeview Cemetery remains accessible to visitors, though few come. The 11 graves are still there, weathered and moss-covered, bearing names that belong to people who were born decades after those stones were carved. Victoria Santos passed away in 2019. Her obituary made no mention of her research into the cemetery. Her family declined to comment on her work when contacted by a local historian. The families in Port Angeles who carry the borrowed names continue to live their lives. They do not speak about the graves. They do not explain the covenant. When children are born into these families, they are sometimes given names that match headstones in the cemetery, names that have been waiting in the ground for over a century, as if the dead knew who would come long before the living arrived. And in the margins of birth certificates filed in S'Klallam County, the notation persists. Registered per Peninsula Covenant, 1885. No one alive remembers what the covenant says, but everyone seems to know that breaking it would mean returning something that was never meant to be kept. The phone has been ringing into empty forest since before anyone remembers installing it. The Ozette Loop Trail is a 9-mile coastal hike in the northwestern corner of Olympic National Park, one of the most remote sections of Washington's Pacific coastline. The trail begins at the Ozette Ranger Station and leads through dense temperate rainforest before emerging onto a wild stretch of beach littered with driftwood, tide pools, and sea stacks. The loop returns inland through similar forest, completing a circuit that takes most hikers 6 to 8 hours. The area has been inhabited by the Maka people for thousands of years. Archaeological sites along the coast have yielded artifacts dating back over 2,000 years, including remnants of longhouses, whaling equipment, and trade goods from distant regions. The land remains culturally significant to the Maka Nation, and certain areas are restricted to protect burial sites and ceremonial grounds. The trail itself was established by the National Park Service in the 1960s as part of an effort to provide coastal wilderness access while minimizing environmental impact. Boardwalks were constructed through wetland sections to prevent erosion. Primitive campsites were designated along the beach. And at mile marker 4.3, where the trail turns inland from the coast, the Park Service installed an emergency call box. The box was a standard backcountry communication device used throughout national parks in the 1970s and 80s. A weatherproof metal enclosure containing a telephone handset connected via buried cable to the ranger station. Hikers could use it to report injuries, medical emergencies, or requests for assistance. The system was simple and reliable, requiring no electricity beyond what the phone line itself provided. By the early 2000s, most emergency call boxes had been replaced by satellite-based communication systems or decommissioned entirely as cell phone coverage expanded. The box at mile marker 4.3 should have been removed in 2001, but it wasn't, and it still works, just not the way it was designed to. The first documented anomaly occurred on August 14, 2004. A hiker named Marcus Delgado was completing the Ozette Loop when he stopped at the emergency call box to rest. Delgado was 37 years old, an experienced outdoorsman from Tacoma who had hiked the trail multiple times. He noticed the call box and, out of curiosity, opened the weathered metal door. The handset was intact, hanging on its cradle inside the enclosure. Delgado lifted the receiver, expecting to hear nothing. Most decommissioned call boxes had been disconnected years earlier. Instead, he heard a clear dial tone. Delgado pressed the handset to his ear and waited. The dial tone continued for approximately 15 seconds. Then it stopped, replaced by silence. Then a voice spoke. "Are you still there?" The voice was male, calm, with no discernible accent. It sounded neither young nor old, and carried a quality Delgado later described as patient, like someone who had been waiting a long time and was willing to wait longer. Delgado, startled, asked who he was speaking to. There was a pause. Then the voice repeated, "Are you still there?" Delgado identified himself and explained he was hiking the trail. He asked if he had reached the ranger station. Another pause. Then, "Are you still there?" Delgado hung up. He reopened the call box and examined the interior. The equipment looked old, but functional. A faded label inside the door read, "Emergency use only, connects to Ozette Ranger Station." Delgado left the area and continued hiking. When he reached the ranger station 2 hours later, he mentioned the call box to a ranger on duty. The ranger, whose name was Sandra Martinez, checked the station's records. According to Park Service documentation, the call box at mile marker 4.3 had been disconnected in 2001. The phone line had been severed, and the equipment was scheduled for removal. Martinez made a note to inspect the box during her next patrol, but did not consider it urgent. 3 weeks later, on September 6, 2004, a couple reported a similar experience. The man, Gregory Walsh, had used the call box to test whether it still functioned. He heard the dial tone, then the same voice asking the same question, "Are you still there?" Martinez hiked to mile marker 4.3 on September 9, 2004, accompanied by another ranger named Kevin O'Brien. They located the call box and opened it. The handset was in place. Martinez lifted the receiver and heard a dial tone. She waited. After several seconds, the voice spoke. "Are you still there?" Martinez identified herself as a park ranger and requested information about the line's destination. The voice did not respond directly. Instead, after a pause, it repeated, "Are you still there?" O'Brien took the receiver and attempted to engage the voice in conversation. He asked questions. "Who are you? Where are you calling from? Why do you keep asking if we're still here?" Each time, after a pause, the voice repeated the same phrase. "Are you still there?" Martinez and O'Brien documented the incident and reported it to park headquarters in Port Angeles. A telecommunications technician hired by the Park Service to inspect backcountry infrastructure visited the site on September 23rd. The technician, a man named Thomas Kowalski, traced the phone line from the call box back toward the ranger station. Kowalski discovered that the line had indeed been severed in 2001, cut at a junction box approximately 1 mile from the call box itself. The cable beyond the cut showed no signs of repair or reconnection, yet the call box continued to produce a dial tone and connect to something. Kowalski tested the line with specialized equipment. He confirmed that current was flowing through the cable, though no identifiable power source could be located. He also noted that the audio signal, the dial tone, and the voice did not match standard telephone system characteristics. "It's not routing through any exchange I can identify," Kowalski wrote in his report. "The signal appears to be isolated, self-contained. I can't explain where it's coming from or where it's going." The Park Service decided to remove the call box entirely. On October 7, 2004, a maintenance crew hiked to mile marker 4.3, dismantled the box, and removed the handset and internal components. The phone line was cut at the source and capped. The metal enclosure was carried out and disposed of. 71 hours later, on October 10th, a solo hiker reported using an emergency call box at mile marker 4.3. The hiker, a woman named Rebecca Holloway, described finding a functional call box, hearing a dial tone, and encountering the same voice asking the same question. Martinez returned to the site on October 12th. The call box was back. Same weathered metal enclosure, same faded label inside, same handset. Martinez opened the box and lifted the receiver. Dial tone. Then the voice. "Are you still there?" Martinez contacted park headquarters immediately. A supervisor, whose name was not included in subsequent reports, instructed her to document the incident but take no further action. Martinez objected, noting that the removed equipment could not have reappeared on its own. The supervisor acknowledged the impossibility but reiterated that further investigation was not authorized at that time. Over the next 6 months, the Park Service removed the call box 4 more times. Each removal was documented with photographs, equipment manifests, and disposal records. Each time, within 72 hours, the call box reappeared, fully functional, at mile marker 4.3. In April of 2005, a linguist from the University of Washington, Dr. Angela Ramirez, was invited to analyze recordings of the voice. Martinez had recorded several conversations using a portable audio device. Ramirez listened to the recordings and noted that the voice exhibited unusual characteristics. "The cadence is wrong," Ramirez explained in her analysis. Human speech has natural rhythm and variation, even when repeating a phrase. This voice has none. It's perfectly consistent across every iteration, same pitch, same timing, same inflection. It's either synthesized, which seems unlikely given the equipment's age, or it's a recording. But if it's a recording, It's responding to presence. It knows when someone picks up the phone. Ramirez also noted that the phrase, "Are you still there?" carried an implication of prior conversation. "It's not a greeting," she said. "It's a continuation. Whoever or whatever is on that line is resuming a conversation it believes was already in progress." In June of 2005, the Park Service contacted the Federal Communications Commission to investigate whether the call box might be connecting to an unauthorized or abandoned telecommunications system. An FCC engineer, whose name was redacted from public records, visited the site and conducted a technical assessment. The engineer's report, portions of which were later released through a Freedom of Information Act request, concluded that the call box operated outside normal telecommunications parameters. The line carried a signal, but the signal did not route through any identifiable network. The dial tone was non-standard, and the voice transmission could not be traced to a source or destination. The report recommended that the Park Service cease attempts to remove the equipment and instead monitor the phenomenon for further data collection. The recommendation was not followed. In August of 2005, the Park Service installed a locked steel cage around the call box, preventing access to the handset. Within 48 hours, hikers reported hearing a phone ringing inside the cage, a mechanical bell sound, repetitive and insistent. Rangers who investigated confirmed the ringing, but found no mechanism inside the call box capable of producing the sound. The cage was removed in September of 2005. The call box returned to its previous state, accessible, functional, waiting. A journalist from Seattle, writing for an outdoor recreation magazine, visited the site in October of 2005 and used the call box. She published an article describing the experience, including a transcript of the exchange. Journalist: "Hello, is anyone there?" Voice: "Are you still there?" Journalist: "Yes, I'm here. Who is this?" Voice: "Are you still there?" Journalist: "I'm trying to understand what this is. Can you tell me?" Voice: "Are you still there?" The journalist noted that the voice never varied, never acknowledged questions, and never provided information beyond the single repeated phrase. She also noted that after hanging up and walking away, she felt a persistent sense of being watched, not by another person, but by the forest itself, as if the trees were waiting to see if she would return to the phone. The call box remains at mile marker 4.3 on the Ozette Loop Trail. The Park Service no longer attempts to remove it. An internal memo from 2006, obtained through public records requests, states, "Equipment at Ozette mile marker 4.3 to remain in place. Do not service or disconnect. Advise hikers that device is non-functional if inquiries are made." But the device is functional. Hikers continue to report using it. Some hear only the dial tone. Others hear the voice. A few claim the voice changes slightly, growing fainter or slower, as if whatever produces it is running down over time. But the question never changes. Are you still there? In 2018, a group of researchers from a paranormal investigation organization requested permission to study the call box. The Park Service denied the request, citing concerns about visitor safety and resource protection. The researchers attempted to visit the site independently, but were turned back by rangers who cited unspecified active research protocols. Martinez retired from the Park Service in 2019. In an informal interview conducted after her retirement, she stated, "I don't know what that thing is or why it's there. I stopped trying to understand it years ago. What bothers me most isn't the voice or the phone. It's the question. Are you still there? It sounds like someone checking in on something that was supposed to stay, like they're making sure whatever was left behind hasn't wandered off. And every time someone picks up that phone, they're confirming, yes, we're still here. We're still exactly where we were supposed to be." the trail remains open. The call box remains functional. And somewhere in the circuit of that impossible line, something continues waiting, pegue, patient, unchanging, asking its question into the forest year after year to anyone willing to answer. The ocean gives back what it takes, but never explains where it has been. Rialto Beach sits at the western terminus of Mora Road, approximately 15 miles west of Forks, Washington. The beach is part of Olympic National Park's coastal strip, a rugged stretch of Pacific shoreline characterized by sea stacks, driftwood accumulations, and tide pools teeming with marine life. The water here is cold year-round, rarely exceeding 55 degrees Fahrenheit even in summer. Currents are strong and unpredictable, influenced by offshore geological features and the meeting of warm and cold water masses. The Quileute people have inhabited this region for thousands of years, maintaining cultural and fishing traditions tied to the coastline. Their oral histories describe the ocean as a living entity with memory and intention, capable of taking and returning, of keeping secrets and revealing them in its own time. Certain areas along the coast are considered spiritually significant, places where the boundary between the physical and metaphysical grows thin. Rialto Beach became accessible to the public in the 1950s when the Park Service improved road access and established parking facilities. The beach attracts approximately 50,000 visitors annually, drawn by dramatic scenery, tide pooling opportunities, and coastal hiking trails. The area is considered relatively safe by park standards, though visitors are warned about rogue waves, unstable driftwood piles, and the dangers of turning their backs on the surf. Lost items are common at any popular beach. Sunglasses, hats, shoes, cameras, objects slip from pockets, get buried in sand, or are carried away by waves. Most are never recovered. The ocean keeps what it takes, except for the watches. The pattern began on July 19, 1981, though it was not recognized as a pattern until years later. A tourist from California named Patricia Galloway visited Rialto Beach with her family. Galloway was 43 years old, a schoolteacher from Sacramento, spending a week exploring the Olympic Peninsula. While photographing sea stacks near the waterline, a wave caught her unexpectedly, soaking her to the waist. When she returned to the parking area, she realized her wristwatch was missing, a Timex with a brown leather band, a gift from her husband on their 15th anniversary. Galloway reported the loss to park rangers, but did not expect to recover the watch. She filed a lost property report as a formality and returned home to California. 6 weeks later, on September 2, 1981, Galloway received a package in the mail. Inside was her watch. It was clean, undamaged, and still running. The time displayed was correct to within 2 minutes. The leather band showed no signs of water damage. There was no note, no explanation, no return address. The package had been postmarked from Forks, Washington on August 28th. Galloway contacted Olympic National Park to inquire if rangers had found and returned the watch. Park records showed no recovery of her property. The ranger she spoke with, a man named Daniel Underwood, suggested that perhaps another visitor had found the watch and mailed it anonymously. Galloway accepted this explanation, though she remained puzzled by the watch's condition. A watch submerged in seawater and buried in sand for 6 weeks should not be functional, let alone accurate. Similar incidents occurred sporadically over the next 12 years. In May of 1984, a man named Raymond Kowalski lost a Seiko diving watch while exploring tide pools. The watch was returned by mail 7 weeks later, running and accurate. In August of 1986, a woman named Eleanor Santos lost a Casio digital watch when a wave swept it from her wrist. It arrived at her home in Portland 5 weeks later, battery still functional, time correct. By 1990, park rangers had logged 7 separate reports of watches being lost at Rialto Beach and subsequently returned by mail to their owners. All followed the same pattern: lost in or near the water, returned weeks later in working condition, no return address, postmarked from Forks. In June of 1991, a couple from British Columbia, Michael and Lisa Thibodeau, visited Rialto Beach during a road trip through the Pacific Northwest. Michael removed his wristwatch, a Swiss-made Omega Seamaster, before wading into the surf to photograph tide pools. He placed the watch in his jacket pocket, which he left on a driftwood log. When he returned, the jacket was there, but the watch was gone. The Thibodeau couple reported the loss to park rangers and filed a police report with the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, as the watch was valuable, worth approximately $1,200. They provided detailed photographs and a serial number for insurance purposes. They did not expect to see it again. 8 weeks later, on August 14, 1991, the watch arrived at their home in Vancouver. It was in perfect condition, running accurately, showing no signs of exposure to water or sand. The Thibodeau couple contacted the sheriff's office, which opened a brief investigation into the return. A detective noted that the postmark was from Forks and that the package contained no fingerprints except those of postal workers and the recipients. Michael Thibodeau had the watch examined by a jeweler and watchmaker in Vancouver. The watchmaker, a man named Gregory Walsh, conducted a detailed inspection. He opened the case and examined the internal mechanism. His findings were documented in a written statement provided to investigators. The movement showed no corrosion, no salt deposits, no moisture damage, Walsh wrote. However, I found something unusual. Microscopic particles of marine sediment were present inside the case, despite the seals being intact. The sediment included diatoms, single-celled algae, consistent with marine environments. But the species present are typically found in tropical or subtropical waters, not the cold Pacific Northwest coast. Walsh also noted that the watch's lubricants had been partially replaced with a substance he could not identify. It resembled standard watch oil, but had different viscosity and chemical properties. I've been working with watches for 30 years, and I've never encountered anything like it. By 1993, 14 cases of returned watches had been documented. Park rangers began keeping a separate log specifically for this phenomenon. A pattern analyst from the University of Washington, Dr. Angela Martinez, reviewed the cases as part of a research project on coastal anomalies. Martinez identified several consistencies. All watches were lost near the waterline at Rialto Beach, typically during high tide. All were returned between 5 and 9 weeks after being lost. All arrived by mail with Forks postmarks. All were functional and accurate upon return. And in 8 cases where forensic analysis was conducted, all showed evidence of exposure to warm salt water between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly warmer than Pacific Northwest coastal waters. Martinez contacted the Forks Post Office to inquire about the packages. The postmaster, a woman named Sandra O'Brien, confirmed that the packages were processed through their facility but could provide no information about who mailed them. "We handle hundreds of packages every week," O'Brien explained. "These come in like any other mail. They're properly stamped and addressed. We have no way of knowing who dropped them in the collection box." Martinez also arranged for chemical analysis of the packaging materials. A forensic laboratory in Seattle examined 3 different packages from separate incidents. The results were confusing. The cardboard and packing materials showed traces of salt, marine organisms, and sand, consistent with items retrieved from a beach environment. But they also showed thermal signatures suggesting prolonged exposure to temperatures around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, far above ambient temperatures in the Olympic Peninsula region. One laboratory technician, Dr. Kenneth Fitzgerald, noted an additional anomaly. The biological material present in the packaging, algae, bacteria, small crustacean fragments, include species that don't exist in Pacific Northwest waters. Some are from the Caribbean, others from the Indian Ocean. It's as if these items passed through multiple marine environments before being packaged and mailed. Martinez submitted her findings to the Journal of Coastal Research in April of 1994. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that while the data was intriguing, the lack of a plausible mechanism for the phenomenon made publication inappropriate. Martinez attempted to secure funding for a more comprehensive investigation, but was unsuccessful. In October of 1993, a retired oceanographer named Dr. Rebecca Holloway read about the returned watches in a regional magazine. Holloway had spent 40 years studying Pacific currents and had developed expertise in object drift patterns, how lost items move through ocean systems based on currents, temperature gradients, and underwater topography. Holloway conducted a theoretical analysis of how a watch lost at Rialto Beach might travel through the Pacific. Her calculations, published informally in a coastal science newsletter, suggested that under normal conditions, a watch lost in the surf would either sink and become buried in sediment or be carried north by prevailing currents toward Vancouver Island. Under no conventional scenario would a watch travel to warm tropical waters and return to Forks, Washington within 2 months. Unless, Holloway wrote, there exists an uncharted current system operating at depths and temperatures we haven't documented, or unless the watches are being moved through pathways that have nothing to do with conventional ocean circulation. Holloway contacted Dr. Martinez and proposed a joint research effort. The two scientists planned to deploy tracking devices at Rialto Beach to monitor water movement and temperature at multiple depths. They submitted a research permit application to Olympic National Park in December of 1993. The permit was denied. Park officials stated that the proposed research would interfere with visitor experience and that insufficient evidence existed to justify the study. Holloway appealed the decision. The appeal was denied without further explanation. In March of 1994, the final documented case occurred. A tourist from Japan lost a wristwatch while photographing sunset at Rialto Beach. The watch was returned by mail 8 weeks later, functional and accurate, with the usual Forks postmark and no return address. After this incident, reports ceased. Either people stopped losing watches or the watches stopped coming back. The watches that were returned remain with their owners, most of whom still possess them. Several have been examined multiple times by watchmakers and forensic specialists. All continue to function normally. None have shown delayed signs of water damage or corrosion. Park rangers no longer maintain a separate log for returned watches. The incident reports from the 1980s and 90s are archived at Olympic National Park headquarters, accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests, but rarely reviewed. Dr. Martinez left academic research in 2001, taking a position with a private environmental consulting firm. She declined to discuss the Rialto Beach watches when contacted by journalists, stating only that some phenomena resist explanation because we lack the conceptual framework to understand them. Dr. Holloway passed away in 2015. Among her personal papers, donated to the University of Washington, was an unpublished manuscript titled Non-Conventional Transport Mechanisms in Coastal Marine Environments. The manuscript proposed that certain geographic locations might function as nexus points, places where objects could enter pathways outside normal physical systems and emerge elsewhere in space or time. The manuscript was never submitted for publication. The beach remains. Tourists continue to visit to photograph sea stacks and explore tide pools. Some lose items to the waves: sunglasses, phones, hats, shoes. Most of these items are never seen again, but occasionally someone visiting Rialto Beach will pause near the waterline, check their watch, and wonder if it slipped from their wrist into the surf, and if the ocean took it down into cold darkness, would it come back? And if it did, where would it have been during those weeks of absence? What warm, impossible waters would it have passed through, carried by currents that don't exist on any map, before finding its way home, clean, undamaged, still keeping time? The birds knew something was wrong with the ground before anyone thought to look beneath it. The Elwha River flows from the high peaks of Olympic National Park to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, carving through 60 miles of temperate rainforest and glacial valleys. For most of the 20th century, two dams, Gleen's Canyon and Elwha, blocked the river, generating hydroelectric power and altering one of the most productive salmon ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. The lower Elwha Klallam tribe fought for decades to restore the river, and in 2011, the largest dam removal project in U.S. history began. The Elwha River Valley is steep-walled and densely forested, with limited road access and few trails penetrating the interior. The area has been inhabited by the lower Elwha Klallam people for thousands of years, and their oral histories describe the valley as a place of spiritual significance, a corridor between worlds where natural laws behave differently than elsewhere. Certain sections of the valley were traditionally avoided, marked by elders as places where the earth holds secrets it doesn't want disturbed. The dam removal attracted scientists from multiple disciplines. Biologists studied salmon recovery. Geologists monitored sediment transport and river morphology. And ornithologists established observation stations to document how bird populations responded to ecosystem restoration. One of those ornithologists was Dr. Patricia Holloway, a migration specialist from the University of Washington who had spent 23 years studying avian navigation and flyway dynamics. In October of 2011, Holloway was stationed at a research camp on the western edge of the Elwha Valley, tracking fall migration patterns. The Pacific Flyway, one of 4 major migratory routes in North America, runs along the coast, channeling millions of birds south from Alaska and Canada toward wintering grounds in California, Mexico, and beyond. Holloway's work focused on how geese, ducks, and other waterfowl navigated coastal corridors and inland river systems. On October 17, 2011, something happened that Holloway had never witnessed in her career. The morning began unremarkably. Holloway and her research assistant, a graduate student named Marcus Delgado, were monitoring a large flock of Canada geese moving south along the river corridor. The flock numbered approximately 600 individuals, tracked via satellite telemetry devices attached to 12 birds during a previous research season. The geese were maintaining a steady altitude of 1,500 feet, traveling at typical migratory speed. At 9:47 a.m., the entire flock stopped. Holloway watched through binoculars as the formation, stretched across nearly a quarter-mile of sky, ceased forward movement. The birds began circling, not in a loose exploratory pattern, but in a tight, repetitive spiral directly above a specific section of the valley. The circling was synchronized, almost mechanical, as if the birds were following an invisible track. Delgado checked the satellite telemetry data on his laptop. All 12 tagged birds showed the same behavior: circular flight path, consistent altitude, no forward progress. The GPS coordinates placed them above a densely forested section of the valley approximately 2 miles upriver from the former Gleen's Canyon Dam site. Holloway and Delgado observed the flock for 4 hours. The birds circled continuously, showing no signs of landing, feeding, or resuming migration. Other flocks passed through the area during that time, maintaining normal southward flight. Only this particular flock remained locked in its circular pattern. At 1:53 p.m., the behavior changed abruptly. The flock broke formation, regrouped, and reversed course, flying north back toward Canada against all migratory instinct. Holloway watched them disappear beyond the ridgeline, moving away from their wintering grounds weeks before they should arrive. She documented the incident in her field notes and flagged it for further analysis. Over the next 3 days, she reviewed satellite data from the 12 tagged birds. The telemetry showed something disturbing. After reversing course, the geese did not return to their breeding grounds. Instead, they scattered across western Washington and British Columbia, abandoning traditional migration routes entirely. By November, 8 of the 12 tagged birds had established wintering territories hundreds of miles away from their normal range. Holloway contacted colleagues at the U.S. Geological Survey's Western Ecological Research Center to report the anomaly. A wildlife biologist named Dr. Raymond Kowalski reviewed her data and agreed the behavior was unprecedented. Canada geese are highly traditional, Kowalski explained in a recorded phone conversation. They follow the same routes, use the same stopover sites, generation after generation. For an entire flock to abort migration and reverse course, especially this late in the season, violates everything we understand about their navigation. Kowalski suggested that the birds might have encountered an environmental hazard, wildfire smoke, unusual weather patterns, or a localized magnetic anomaly interfering with their navigation. Holloway investigated each possibility. Smoke and weather data for October 17th showed clear skies and normal atmospheric conditions. Magnetic field measurements from nearby monitoring stations showed no anomalies. In December of 2011, Holloway returned to the Elwha Valley with portable magnetometers to measure magnetic field strength in the area where the geese had circled. She was accompanied by a geophysicist from the University of Oregon, Dr. Angela Martinez, who specialized in biomagnetic navigation, the study of how animals use Earth's magnetic field to orient themselves during migration. Martinez conducted measurements at multiple locations within the valley. Most readings were normal, consistent with baseline magnetic field strength for the region. But in a roughly circular area approximately 200 acres in size, centered on the coordinates where the geese had circled, the readings were anomalous. "We detected localized distortions," Martinez said in a later interview. "Nothing extreme, but measurable. The magnetic field in that zone was approximately 0.3% stronger than surrounding areas, with slight directional deviations. For a bird relying on magnetic cues for navigation, that's enough to cause confusion. But it doesn't explain why the bird circled for 4 hours instead of simply adjusting course and continuing south." Martinez also noted that the anomaly appeared to be subsurface in origin. The distortion wasn't coming from surface features, no magnetic rock outcrops, no buried metal debris. It was deeper, much deeper. In January of 2012, Holloway submitted a research proposal to Olympic National Park requesting permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys in the affected area. The proposal outlined her observations, Martinez's magnetic field data, and a request to investigate potential subsurface geological features that might explain the avian behavior. The Park Service approved the request in March of 2012. Holloway assembled a team including Martinez, Delgado, and a geophysical survey contractor named Gregory Walsh. Walsh operated a commercial ground-penetrating radar system capable of imaging subsurface structures to depths of 300 feet. The team conducted surveys in April of 2012, focusing on the 200-acre zone where magnetic anomalies had been detected. Walsh's equipment operated on multiple frequencies, building a composite image of subsurface geology. The initial scan showed typical features: soil layers, bedrock, underground water channels. Then, at a depth of 180 feet, the radar detected something else. Walsh described it in his technical report as a geometric metallic structure inconsistent with natural geological formations. The radar image showed a roughly rectangular object approximately 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 8 feet thick. The object appeared to be composed of material with high electrical conductivity, consistent with metal alloys, but not matching the signatures of common metals like iron, copper, or aluminum. Walsh conducted multiple passes over the site, adjusting frequencies and angles to refine the image. The object remained consistent across all scans. It was oriented at a 15-degree angle relative to the surface, partially embedded in bedrock. The radar also detected what appeared to be smaller objects or structures extending from the main mass, branch-like protrusions that could be antennae, sensors, or structural supports. Holloway contacted the National Park Service to report the findings. A regional geologist, Dr. Kenneth Fitzgerald, reviewed the radar data and agreed the object was anomalous. "It's not a natural formation," Fitzgerald stated in his assessment. "The geometry is too regular, and the material properties don't match anything that should be at that depth in this region." The National Park Service opened a formal investigation in May of 2012. A team of geologists, archaeologists, and park officials visited the site to assess the radar findings and determine next steps. The investigation was led by a park superintendent whose name was redacted from subsequent public documents. Initial theories suggested the object might be debris from historical logging operations, buried equipment, metal cables, or structural remnants from the dam construction era. However, archival research showed no logging activity in that specific area, and the dams were located miles downstream. Additionally, the depth of the object, 180 feet below the surface, was inconsistent with anything that could have been buried during industrial activities in the valley. An archaeologist from the Maka Cultural and Research Center, whose name was not disclosed, was consulted to determine if the object might have cultural or historical significance to indigenous peoples in the region. The archaeologist reviewed the radar data and tribal oral histories, but found no references to buried structures or artifacts in that location. They did note that certain Klallam traditions describe things beneath the mountains that predate human occupation of the peninsula, though these accounts are symbolic and not geographically specific. In July of 2012, the Park Service contacted the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to request assistance with a potential excavation. The Corps declined, stating that the site's location within a national park, combined with the depth and unknown composition of the object, made excavation logistically complex and potentially environmentally damaging. They recommended non-invasive monitoring and additional research before considering extraction. In August of 2012, Holloway received notification that her research permit for the Elwha Valley had been suspended pending review. No explanation was provided beyond a reference to ongoing administrative evaluation. Holloway requested clarification. Her request was acknowledged, but not answered. In September of 2012, Holloway was informed by university administrators that her access to satellite telemetry data for the Elwha geese study had been restricted. The data had been classified as sensitive research information by an unidentified federal agency. Holloway filed a formal complaint with the university's research office. The complaint was not resolved. Martinez attempted to return to the Elwha Valley in October of 2012 to conduct follow-up magnetic field measurements. Her research permit application was denied by Olympic National Park. No reason was provided. The Elwha River continues to flow freely, the dams removed, the salmon returning. The valley has been restored to something resembling its pre-industrial state. Bird migration proceeds normally through the corridor. No further incidents of mid-flight reversals or prolonged circling have been reported. But the 200-acre zone remains. Holloway's data, Martinez's magnetic measurements, and Walsh's radar images are archived in university repositories, accessible through research requests but rarely examined. In 2018, a journalist from Seattle attempted to investigate the incident for a regional magazine. The journalist, whose article was never published, obtained portions of Holloway's field notes through a public records request. The notes included a final entry dated November 2, 2012. Birds don't circle for 4 hours without reason. They were warning us, or waiting for something. Whatever is down there 180 feet beneath the forest floor, it's still there. And it's still doing whatever caused 600 geese to turn around and fly away from where they were supposed to go. I don't know if we found something, or if something wanted to be found, but I know this. The birds haven't flown over that valley since. They've rerouted. They've changed a migration pattern thousands of years old to avoid a 200-acre circle of forest. That tells me everything I need to know about whether we should leave it alone. The object remains buried. The valley remains quiet. And every October, geese flying south along the Pacific Flyway make a subtle course adjustment, a small detour, barely noticeable on satellite maps, to avoid the place where the Earth holds something it refuses to explain. Eight people dreamed the same thing on the same night, and what they dreamed was a map to a body. Lake Crescent Lodge sits on the southern shore of Lake Crescent, a glacially carved body of water in Olympic National Park known for its exceptional clarity and depth. The lake reaches 460 feet at its deepest point, and its cold, oxygen-poor waters preserve organic material with unusual fidelity. The lodge was built in 1915 as a fishing resort and has operated continuously for over a century, hosting visitors drawn by the lake's pristine beauty and the surrounding old-growth forest. The building itself is rustic, wood-framed, with creaking floors and narrow hallways that still smell faintly of cedar and old varnish. The lodge contains 30 guest rooms, most of them small and simply furnished, in a style that has changed little since the 1940s. Windows face the lake, offering views of water that shifts from deep blue to near black depending on the light. The lodge is isolated. The nearest town, Port Angeles, is 20 miles east. Cell phone service is unreliable. At night, the only sounds are wind through Douglas fir and the occasional lap of water against the shore. In winter, the lodge receives few visitors. February is the slowest month, with occupancy rarely exceeding 20%. Most guests are locals seeking quiet or travelers willing to endure rain and cold for solitude. The staff is minimal: a manager, a housekeeper, a cook, and a maintenance worker. The lodge feels larger than it is when empty, its hallways echoing with footsteps that might be your own or might belong to someone else entirely. On the night of February 6, 1999, 8 guests stayed at Lake Crescent Lodge. None of them knew each other, none of them had communicated before checking in, and all of them woke at approximately 3:20 a.m. with the same memory of a dream that felt too real to be sleep. The first guest to report the dream was a woman named Patricia Galloway, a retired librarian from Seattle who had booked a weekend stay to escape city noise. Galloway came to the front desk at 7:30 a.m. on February 7th and asked to speak with the lodge manager, a man named Daniel Underwood. She appeared shaken, tired, and reluctant to explain what had disturbed her. "I had a nightmare," Galloway told Underwood, "about a woman standing in my room. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a dress from the 40s maybe, dark hair pinned up. She didn't move. She just stood at the foot of my bed and pointed toward the window, toward the lake, and she kept saying numbers over and over, 397261. Just those 6 numbers, repeated like a chant. Underwood listened politely and assured Galloway that the lodge was safe and that nightmares were common responses to unfamiliar sleeping environments. Galloway accepted this explanation, but mentioned that the dream felt different, not like sleep, but like something she had witnessed. An hour later, a man named Raymond Kowalski approached the front desk. Kowalski was a software engineer from Portland, traveling alone. He asked if anyone else had reported unusual dreams. Underwood asked why. Kowalski described the same experience. A woman in 1940s clothing, standing motionless, pointing toward the lake, repeating a 6-digit number. The number was identical, 397261. By noon, 6 more guests had come forward. All 8 guests, staying in different rooms, ranging from age 27 to 73, with no connections to each other, reported the same dream. Same woman. Same clothing, same gesture, same number. Underwood documented the reports in the lodge's incident log, unsure what else to do. He contacted Olympic National Park headquarters in Port Angeles and spoke with a park ranger named Sandra Martinez. Martinez suggested the guests might have unconsciously influenced each other through overheard conversations or shared anxiety, a phenomenon known as mass suggestion. Underwood noted that the guests had checked in at different times, eaten separately, and had not interacted before reporting their dreams. One of the 8 guests, a psychology professor from the University of Washington named Dr. Angela Ramirez, became interested in the phenomenon from a research perspective. Ramirez specialized in sleep studies and had published papers on shared dreaming in controlled environments. She interviewed each of the 7 other guests, documenting their experiences in detail. Ramirez found that all 8 accounts were consistent not only in content, but in sensory detail. The woman in the dream wore a dark blue dress with white collar trim. Her hair was styled in a victory roll, a fashion popular during the 1940s. Her face was pale, expressionless. She did not speak except to repeat the number. And she pointed with her right hand, index finger extended, toward the lake with an urgency that all 8 dreamers interpreted as directive. What struck me most, Ramirez said in a later interview, was that none of them described it as surreal or dreamlike. They all said it felt real, like the woman was actually in the room with them, like they were witnessing something rather than dreaming it. Ramirez also noted that all 8 guests woke at approximately the same time, between 3:15 and 3:25 a.m. Sleep patterns vary widely among individuals, making simultaneous waking unusual. She checked the lodge's environmental conditions, carbon monoxide levels, air quality, water quality. All were normal. She reviewed the building's history for reports of previous shared dreams or unusual experiences. She found nothing. The 6-digit number intrigued her. Ramirez recognized that it might be a coordinate, a date, a code, or simply random noise produced by the subconscious. She suggested to Underwood that the number be shared with park officials to determine if it had any significance. Underwood contacted Sandra Martinez again on February 9th. Martinez was skeptical but agreed to investigate. She began by checking if the number corresponded to any park documentation, trail markers, radio frequencies, facility codes. It did not. She then contacted a cartographer with the U.S. Geological Survey, a man named Gregory Walsh, to inquire if the number might represent a geographic coordinate. Walsh reviewed the number in various formats. As a single coordinate, it was meaningless. But when separated into 2 3-digit groups, 397 and 261, and interpreted as depth measurements in feet, the number aligned with a specific location in Lake Crescent, 397 feet east of a reference point on the southern shore at a depth of 261 feet. Martinez reported Walsh's findings to Olympic National Park's Law Enforcement Division on February 12, 1999. A supervising ranger, whose name was redacted from public records, reviewed the report and authorized a preliminary underwater survey of the coordinates. The lake was deep, cold, and notoriously difficult to search, but the specificity of the location justified investigation. On March 4, 1999, a dive team from the Clallam County Sheriff's Office conducted a sonar survey of the area identified by the coordinates. The team used side-scan sonar capable of imaging the lakebed at depths exceeding 300 feet. The survey located an anomaly at a depth of 258 feet, within 3 feet of the depth specified by the dream number. The anomaly appeared to be a submerged vehicle. Additional sonar passes confirmed the shape: a car resting upright on the lakebed, partially embedded in sediment. The vehicle's position suggested it had entered the water from the southern shore and descended to the bottom intact. A remotely operated submersible was deployed on March 9th to visually inspect the vehicle. Video footage showed a 1941 Chevrolet sedan, dark in color, with Washington state license plates obscured by silt. The car's windows were intact. The doors were closed. Inside, preserved by the lake's cold water, were the remains of a human body in the driver's seat. The discovery became a law enforcement matter. The car was raised from the lake on March 17, 1999. The body was transported to the Clallam County Medical Examiner's Office for identification. Forensic analysis determined that the remains were those of a woman, approximately 30 to 40 years old at time of death, dressed in clothing consistent with the early 1940s. Dental records eventually identified her as Eleanor Santos, a Port Angeles resident who had been reported missing in December of 1942. Historical records indicated that Santos had disappeared after leaving her home to visit a friend near Lake Crescent. Her car and body were never found, and the case remained unsolved for 57 years. The discovery of the vehicle suggested that Santos had driven off the road into the lake, possibly due to poor visibility or road conditions, and that the car had sunk into deep water where it remained undetected for decades. The circumstances of the discovery, 8 guests dreaming an identical image that led directly to the car's location, were documented in internal Park Service reports but not publicly discussed. Ramirez attempted to publish a paper on the incident in the Journal of Sleep Research. Her submission was rejected. Reviewers noted that the evidence was anecdotal and that no mechanism existed to explain how unrelated individuals could share the same dream content with such specificity. Ramirez contacted the 8 guests in May of 1999 to inform them that the number from their dream had led to the discovery of a missing person's remains. All 8 expressed shock and discomfort. None could explain the dream. Several requested that their names not be used in any public discussion of the incident. One guest, a woman named Victoria Walsh, told Ramirez that she had dreamed of the woman again on the night of March 17th, the night the car was raised from the lake. In the second dream, the woman stood in the same position, but no longer pointed. She simply watched, then faded. Walsh said she interpreted this as closure, though she acknowledged the interpretation was purely subjective. The Lake Crescent Lodge continued operating normally. Underwood remained manager until his retirement in 2007. He rarely discussed the shared dream incident, but in a private interview conducted years later, he stated, "I've worked here for 23 years. I've heard every kind of story about this place. Ghosts, hauntings, strange sounds. Most of it's just imagination. But what happened in February of '99 wasn't imagination. 8 people saw the same thing and told us where to find a woman who'd been missing since before most of them were born. That's not psychology. That's something else." Eleanor Santos was buried in Port Angeles in April of 1999, 57 years after her disappearance. Her case was officially closed. The Chevrolet was documented as evidence and later donated to a local historical society where it remains on display as part of an exhibit on Olympic Peninsula history. The 8 guests who shared the dream have never publicly identified themselves. Ramirez's research notes, archived at the University of Washington, contain their testimonies but not their names. Attempts to replicate the phenomenon, conducting controlled sleep studies at the lodge, have produced no have results. The lodge still operates, hosting visitors year-round. Room availability is posted online. Reservations can be made months in advance. And every February, on the night of the 6th, the lodge is always fully booked, though the guests who request that specific night rarely explain why, and the staff has learned not to ask. Because some of them come hoping to dream, and some come hoping they won't. But all of them check their windows before sleeping, making sure they face the lake, just in case a woman in 1940s clothing decides there's something else she needs to show them. Another number, another depth, another place where something lost is still waiting to be found. The ledger balanced perfectly, down to the last cent, across 55 years of transactions that no institution has ever recorded. Ruby Beach is the northernmost beach in the coastal section of Olympic National Park, named for the garnet-colored sand that appears at low tide. The beach sits at the mouth of Cedar Creek, surrounded by sea stacks that rise from the water like monuments to erosion and time. Driftwood accumulates in massive piles along the high tide line, some logs measuring over 60 feet long, stripped and bleached by decades of exposure to salt water and sun. The area has been used by the Quileute people for thousands of years, primarily for fishing and gathering shellfish. The coastline is treacherous, cold water, strong currents, and unpredictable riptides that have claimed numerous lives over the past century. The beach is accessible via a short trail from Highway 101, receiving approximately 100,000 visitors annually despite its isolation. Objects wash ashore regularly: glass fishing floats from Japan, plastic debris from container ships, fragments of boats destroyed in storms. The National Park Service maintains a lost and found at the Ruby Beach parking area, where visitors can report discoveries or claim items. Most finds are unremarkable: shoes, water bottles, beach toys. Occasionally something more significant appears: pieces of shipwrecks, maritime equipment, personal belongings from vessels long gone. In August of 2007, a hiker found something that should not have existed. The hiker was a woman named Patricia Holloway, a 52-year-old accountant from Spokane who was spending a week exploring the Olympic Peninsula. On the afternoon of August 14th, Holloway was walking near the tide line when she noticed a metal case partially buried in sand near the base of a large driftwood log. The case was aluminum, approximately 12 inches by 9 inches, with a rubber gasket seal designed to make it waterproof. The exterior showed corrosion and barnacle growth, consistent with extended saltwater exposure. Holloway opened the case. In it was a leather-bound journal, dry and intact. The journal measured roughly 8 inches by 10 inches, with a cover embossed with the words Pacific Trust, Confidential Records. Holloway flipped through the pages. They contained handwritten financial entries, dates, transaction descriptions, dollar amounts, organized in neat columns. The handwriting was precise, executed in blue ink with what appeared to be a fountain pen. Holloway was familiar with accounting records. The entries in the journal followed standard bookkeeping practices: debits and credits, running balances, dated transactions. What made them unusual was the date range. The first entry was dated January 7th, 1952. The most recent entry was dated July 29, 2007, 16 days before. Holloway found the case. She brought the journal to the ranger station at the Ruby Beach parking area. The ranger on duty, a man named Daniel Kowalski, examined the case and journal, noted the discovery in his log, and contacted Olympic National Park headquarters in Port Angeles. The item was classified as found property and held for 30 days in case someone claimed it. No one did. In October of 2007, the journal was transferred to Park Archives as an unclaimed item of potential historical interest. A park historian, Dr. Angela Martinez, reviewed the contents as part of routine cataloging. Martinez had worked with historical documents for 15 years and immediately recognized that the journal was anomalous. The entries spanned 55 years, documenting financial transactions for an entity called the Pacific Trust. The transactions included deposits, withdrawals, interest calculations, and transfers. Account numbers were listed, dollar amounts were precise. The running balance was maintained meticulously, starting at $12,347 in 1952 and reaching just over $1.8 million by 2007. Martinez noted that the handwriting appeared consistent throughout. The same person had made all entries across 5 decades. The ink looked fresh throughout the journal, showing no signs of aging or fading. Entries from 1952 appeared as dark and clear as entries from 2007. Martinez contacted a forensic document examiner in Seattle, Dr. Kenneth Fitzgerald, to analyze the journal. Fitzgerald visited Port Angeles in November of 2007 and conducted a detailed examination. His findings were contradictory and disturbing. The paper was authentic 1950 stock, high-quality cotton-based paper manufactured between 1948 and 1957 by a company that ceased operations in 1961. Chemical analysis confirmed the paper's age, but the ink was recent. Fitzgerald tested multiple entries throughout the journal using spectroscopy and chromatography. The ink composition matched modern ballpoint pen ink manufactured after 2003, yet the entries appeared to have been written with a fountain pen, and fountain pen ink chemistry was entirely different. "The contradiction is absolute," Fitzgerald wrote in his report. "The paper is over 50 years old. The ink is less than 5 years old, but the ink has penetrated the paper fibers in a manner consistent with having been there for decades. I can't reconcile these findings using any known document creation or forgery technique." Fitzgerald also analyzed the handwriting. He compared entries from different decades within the journal. The script was identical, same pressure, same letter formation, same spacing. Either the same person had written all entries across 55 years while maintaining perfectly consistent handwriting, or someone had recently created the entire document using vintage paper and somehow aged the ink artificially. Martinez attempted to trace the Pacific Trust. She searched corporate registries, bank records, financial archives, and historical business directories. No entity by that name had ever been registered in Washington State, Oregon, or California. She contacted the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Internal Revenue Service to inquire about historical financial institutions operating in the Pacific Northwest. Neither agency had records of a Pacific Trust. The account numbers listed in the journal did not match any known banking system formats used during the 1950s or since. The transaction descriptions were vague but suggestive. Timber proceeds, Hoh Valley. Mineral rights transfer, Cascade Range. Settlement payment, coastal lease, interest accrual, offshore holdings. The entries implied natural resource transactions, land deals, and investment activity spanning decades. Martinez showed the journal to a retired banker from Port Angeles, a man named Gregory Walsh, who had worked in the regional banking industry from 1963 to 2002. Walsh reviewed the entries and the accounting methods. He confirmed that the bookkeeping was technically correct and that the balance calculations were accurate, but he noted something strange. "The transactions don't behave like real money," Walsh said. "There are no tax payments recorded, no regulatory fees, no overhead expenses, just deposits, interest, and occasional withdrawals. It reads like an idealized version of how wealth accumulates, mathematically perfect, but divorced from the practical realities of finance and regulation." Walsh also noted that the interest rates applied in the journal were consistent with prevailing rates during each period. Entries from the 1950s showed interest compounding at 3 to 4% annually. Entries from the 1980s showed rates above 10%. Entries from the 2000s showed lower rates consistent with post-recession economics. "Whoever created this understood financial history," Walsh observed, "or they lived through it." In December of 2007, Martinez contacted the woman who had found the journal, Patricia Holloway, to ask if she remembered any additional details about the discovery site. Holloway confirmed that the metal case had been partially buried in sand near the high tide line, approximately 15 feet from a large driftwood log. She estimated the case had been there for some time based on barnacle growth and corrosion. Martinez visited Ruby Beach on January 9, 2008, to inspect the location where the case had been found. She brought a metal detector and surveyed the area. Detector registered no buried metal objects. Martinez also examined the driftwood log Holloway had described. The log was still there, weathered and immobile. Martinez took photographs and soil samples but found nothing unusual. A marine biologist from the University of Washington, Dr. Rebecca Santos, was asked to examine the barnacle growth on the metal case. Santos identified the barnacles as Balanus glandula, a common species along the Pacific Northwest coast. Based on size and growth patterns, Santos estimated the barnacles had been attached to the case for approximately 2 to 3 years. This suggested the case had been in saltwater or interdidal zones for at least that long before washing ashore. But the journal inside the case contained entries dated up to 16 days before discovery. If the case had been sealed and submerged for 2 to 3 years, how had someone continued making entries in the journal? Martinez requested that the case be examined for signs of recent opening or resealing. A forensic technician determined that the gasket seal showed no evidence of having been opened and resealed. The seal was intact, functioning, and consistent with a case that had been closed once and remained closed since. In March of 2008, Martinez submitted a formal report to Olympic National Park headquarters summarizing her findings. The report noted the journal's physical impossibilities, the lack of any corresponding financial institution, and the absence of plausible explanations for how the document could exist in its current form. Martinez recommended that the journal be transferred to a federal agency with expertise in document fraud and financial crime. The recommendation was not followed. A park superintendent, whose name was redacted from subsequent correspondence, responded that the journal was likely a historical curiosity or artistic project and did not warrant further investigation. Martinez objected, citing the forensic evidence. Her objection was acknowledged but not acted upon. The journal remains in Olympic National Park archives, stored in a climate-controlled facility in Port Angeles. Access requires special permission, rarely granted. Martinez retired from the Park Service in 2013. In a private interview conducted after her retirement, she stated, "I've worked with thousands of historical documents. I know what real artifacts look like. That journal is real, the paper, the construction, the physical object. But the content is impossible. It documents 55 years of financial activity for an entity that never existed, written in ink that's both decades old and brand new. Someone or something has been keeping those books. And if the last entry was made 16 days before the journal was found, then whoever was writing in it was still active in 2007. Patricia Holloway, the woman who found the journal, was contacted again. In 2015 by a journalist researching unexplained discoveries along the Olympic coast. Holloway confirmed the details of her find, but added something she had not mentioned previously. When I opened the case, she said, the journal was lying open, not closed, but open to the last page with entries, and the ink on that page was wet, not dried. Wet, like someone had just written in it. I touched it with my finger and the ink smeared. I remember thinking that was strange, but I didn't mention it to the ranger because it seemed impossible. Salt water would have destroyed the journal, but if the case had been sealed the whole time, how did someone just write in it? The journalist attempted to follow up on this detail, but Holloway declined further interviews. She moved from Spokane to an undisclosed location in 2016 and has not responded to subsequent contact attempts. The Pacific Trust, if it ever existed, has left no trace in official records. But the ledger continues to balance. Its final entry, dated July 29, 2007, showing a balance of $1,873,412.19. The accounting is perfect. The transactions are documented with meticulous precision, and somewhere in saltwater or on shore, someone may still be keeping the books, recording deposits and withdrawals for an institution that exists only in ink on vintage paper, managing wealth that has no origin and serves no purpose anyone has been able to identify.